um, full committee hearing entitled Universal Vouchers Ending Homelessness and Expanding Economic Opportunity in America is now called to order. And we are very fortunate to have some excellent witnesses with us today. And the committee will come to order. And without objections, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. As a reminder, I ask all members to keep themselves muted when they are not being recognized. The staff have been instructed not to mute members except where a member is not being recognized and there is inadvertent background noise. Members are also reminded that they may only participate in one remote proceeding at a time. If you are participating today, please keep your camera on. If you choose to attend a different remote proceeding, please turn your camera off. Before we begin, I will recognize myself to call up the resolution offered by Ranking Member McHenry, naming the new subcommittee ranking member and subcommittee membership. Copies of the resolution were made available in advance. Without objection, the resolution is adopted. I now recognize myself for my committee comments, and then when the ranking member, when the chair is available, she will perhaps add some opening comments. I'd like to thank her and also our ranking member McHenry for this important hearing. Today's discussion comes at a time when on any given night in this enormously wealthy nation, hundreds of thousands of Americans are without a home and millions more live in fear that their families may end up homeless in the near future. Through your leadership, Madam Chair, even the most vulnerable among us, those who also depend on their Congress to find solutions to great challenges in this nation, continue to have representation in these halls. And I'm proud to join Chairwoman Waters and the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, in proposing the Ending Homelessness Act of 2021, which would make housing choice vouchers an entitlement for those who qualify and would ban landlords from discriminating against voucher holders, including banning discrimination based on source of income and veteran status. Rigorous research continues to demonstrate that vouchers sharply reduce homelessness, housing instability, and overcrowding, and would better prepare the nation to handle the next health or economic crisis. Finally, I would also like to congratulate my colleague, Congressman French Hill, who I've enjoyed working with in the past, on receiving the confidence to assume the role of ranking member of the Housing Subcommittee. I look forward to what he can continue to accomplish under your leadership, Madam Chair, and also Mr. McHenry. We look forward to bringing a number of areas of agreement to this chair, to this committee in the future. And with that, I would like to now recognize or introduce our witnesses.
Mr. Chairman, traditionally the ranking member is recognized for an opening statement at this point.
Yes, and as I told you, there would be some stumbles because I'm just getting into that. And thank you for reminding me. The chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. McHenry from North Carolina.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, Chairman Cleaver, thank you, and thank you for handling adeptly what you've been thrown into here late in the game. But thank you for starting the hearing. Look, today, frankly, we're having a hearing. Today's hearing is about creating a brand new, massive open-ended federal entitlement program for quote-unquote universal housing vouchers. We should be focused on the immediate needs of the economy, like the 9.3 million job openings that were unfilled this month and the record 4 million workers who quit their jobs in April. But rather, we're going to focus on fulfilling a progressive priority that would result in the largest expansion of the Department of Housing and Urban Development in its entire history. Under this proposal, an additional 14 million plus households could qualify for the Housing Choice Voucher Program based on their income status alone, which means the cost would jump from $25 billion to $185 billion per year. Now, it's important to note, $185 billion is nearly 2.5 times the entire annual cost of the Department of Homeland Security. To be clear, creating a universal housing voucher entitlement does nothing to increase the supply of rental housing. This means that skyrocketing demand in already expensive markets would drive rental prices higher and make affordable units less available. It's ironic that we're here today to discuss another bad Democrat housing proposal when we really need to be focused on cleaning up the Biden administration's latest mess. Last Congress, we came together to approve $25 billion to repay renters' back rent debts. That money was specifically designed to make sure no renter would be faced with a pandemic-related eviction through no fault of their own. Before that money was even out the door, Democrats pushed through another $21.6 billion in rental assistance as a part of the partisan American Rescue Plan. Now, nearly 6 months after the first tranche of funding was enacted, the Treasury Department cannot tell us if anyone has actually had their back rent debts paid off. The Treasury's exact response when I asked last month, well, we will, quote, provide this data as soon as practicable, end quote. Now, let me translate that. They have no clue where that $46.6 billion in aid is or how it's being used. This is an abject failure by the Biden administration. I'm sure I don't need to remind my colleagues across the aisle that we have a deadline. The federal eviction moratorium will end this month. If this aid is not delivered to renters, they could become homeless. And instead of addressing this looming crisis today, we're talking about a long-held progressive priority that will do nothing to help renters. And this is mismanagement at the highest levels. But as we saw last week when Securities Exchange Commission Chair Gensler decided to simply remove the entire accounting oversight board, the mismanagement seems to be a trend in Democrat-run Washington. When you have full partisan control, the House and the Senate and the White House in Democrat hands, this is the type of mismanagement we're seeing. Committee Republicans will be introducing a bill to at least end mismanagement of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. This bill will get the money out the door as soon as possible and make sure that all $46 billion is used to settle back rent debts and protect renters facing eviction. This idea is simple, bipartisan, common sense, and holds government accountable. And we're going to be serious about rental assistance needs of the American people. And this bill is that strong start to do that, not with another bad Democrat policy that we'll be back here trying to fix in a year. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cleaver, for stepping in and proceeding with our hearing. Unfortunately, we got caught in a very difficult situation, could not get here. But let us proceed and let us go on. Now that the ranking member has spoken, do we have, let's see.
Mr. Hill, has 1 minute.
Mr. Hill of Arkansas is recognized for 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Regarding the idea of universal entitlement vouchers, clearly this idea is not well timed or even well considered, as it wasn't even proposed by Secretary Fudge in her enormous 2022 HUD budget. But to the main issue of the day, to the here and now, the Treasury has no idea where the total of $46 billion in rental assistance is or how it's being spent. If that's not a perfect example of poor governance and oversight, I'm not sure what is. I can tell you in my home state of Arkansas, of the $200 million allocated by Congress in December appropriations on a bipartisan basis, a mere $18,500 has actually been paid out to landlords. And to make it worse, the program wasn't even operational until just a few days ago at the beginning of June. I look forward to working with my Republican colleagues to help get the rental assistance into the hands of the American people that need it most. I yield back, Madam Chair.
I want to welcome today's distinguished witnesses to the committee. First, we have Ms. Anne Olivia, a senior fellow, Center on Budget Policies and Priorities. Next, we have Ms. Mary Cunningham, a vice president with the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy at the Urban Institute. Next, we have Mr. Benjamin Metcalf, a managing director with the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at the University of California, Berkeley. Next, we have Ms. Chancellor Al-Mansour, the executive director of the Housing Rights Center. And last, we have Mr. Howard Hosak, an adjunct scholar for the domestic policy at the American Enterprise Institute. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Each of you will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. You should be able to see a timer on your screen that will indicate how much time you have left, and a chime will go off at the end of your time. So I would ask you to be mindful of the timer and quickly wrap up your testimony if you hear the chime. Ms. Olivia, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, my name is Anne Oliva, and I'm a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I commend the chairwoman for convening this important hearing and for her continued leadership on homelessness. The Ending Homelessness Act of 2021, introduced by the chairwoman as well as Representatives Cleaver and Torres, would foster stronger communities and inarguably improve the lives of people who are struggling to secure affordable housing. The nation is experiencing a homelessness crisis that predates the pandemic. In 2020, 30 states saw a rise in homelessness. And for the first time since we started gathering this data, the number of individuals living on the streets exceeded the number of individuals living in shelters. Without a significant federal investment in affordable housing, these conditions will only grow worse and continue to cause harm to the people who feel this crisis most acutely. Expanding the Housing Choice Voucher Program to assist all eligible households is the most important and effective step Congress can take to address this crisis. While the chairwoman's bill is the most comprehensive option, Congress should also enact the president's proposed fiscal year 22 voucher funding increase and include a large-scale multi-year voucher expansion in the upcoming recovery legislation. Both of these investments are urgently needed since vouchers are available for just 1 in 4 eligible households. And while the housing investments in the American Jobs Plan are significant, less than 1% of the funding dedicated to housing was allocated to expanding rental assistance. Unless a household also receives rental assistance, construction subsidies rarely produce housing with rents that are affordable for households with incomes around or below the poverty line. So in order to make a significant reduction in homelessness, Congress must address this imbalance and fund more vouchers in the recovery plan. HUD reports that more than 580,000 people experienced homelessness on a single night in January of 2020, and that nearly 1.5 million people experienced sheltered homelessness at some time in 2018. And while that tells you how many people are experiencing homelessness, I want to take a moment to describe who is experiencing homelessness. People of color are disproportionately impacted. Families are typically headed by women and include a high percentage of young children. 17% of all family households are headed by a young parent aged 18 to 24, and more than 113,000 unaccompanied youth stayed in a shelter or transitional bed in a year. There are more than 37,000 homeless veterans and more than 110,000 people who are chronically homeless. And people experiencing homelessness often work and still cannot afford housing. The health and economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has also disproportionately impacted communities of color, has only made the situation more dire. And this is clear. Homeless assistance systems cannot end homelessness alone. We must take a comprehensive approach to address housing affordability and do so at every opportunity we have, including in the upcoming recovery package. To prepare for this hearing, I met with people who've experienced homelessness. Several told me about waiting in shelters for months or more than a year for a voucher, or never receiving one at all. They said providing more vouchers will have the greatest impact on people experiencing homelessness, and that they also want Congress to address challenges faced by voucher holders in the housing market. Every day, frontline staff in homeless systems are required to make devastating choices about who will get the help they need. Is a young person who is being trafficked in exchange for a place to sleep more in need than a person with a serious mental illness living on the streets, or a family with young children living in their car? With an expansion of housing choice vouchers, we can have a different system. Imagine a system that, instead of being forced to prioritize people based on how sick or in danger they are, can quickly offer a homeless family, youth, or individual a permanent housing option. Imagine a system where outreach to people living on the streets is more than an offer of a blanket, a bottle of water, or a granola bar, but has a real housing option attached. If long-term guaranteed funding was provided for housing choice vouchers, the effects would be enormous. Providing a voucher to all eligible households would lift 9.3 million people above the poverty line, and these benefits would be greatest among people of color. Congress can take a step towards this vision by ensuring significant multi-year voucher funding is included in the Economic Recovery Plan, and by passing the Ending Homelessness Act of 2021. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. Next, we will recognize Ms. Mary Cunningham, a Vice President with the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy at the Urban Institute.
Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Mary Cunningham. I'm a Senior Fellow and Vice President for the Metropolitan Housing Community Center at the Urban Institute. The views expressed here are my own, not those of the Urban Institute, its trustees, or its funders. When the pandemic hit in March 2020, the United States had already been grappling with a severe and enduring affordable housing and homelessness crisis. Approximately 580,000 people were experiencing homelessness on any given night, and nearly 11 million renters were severely cost-burdened. This crisis disproportionately impacts people of color, particularly Black and Latinx communities. The housing safety net was unprepared to respond to the urgent needs of the pandemic, a public health crisis layered on top of a housing crisis. The lack of stable housing for many caused immense human suffering and lives lost, but also put the rest of the country at risk by reducing people's ability to socially distance in place and increasing transmission rates. Congress responded with billions of dollars in emergency housing assistance, but states and localities are rushing and working overtime to distribute these funds before the CDC eviction moratorium expires in 21 days. Last month, an estimated 7 million renters were still behind on their rent, and about 3 million people reported a likelihood of facing eviction. We're facing a mass eviction crisis and significant increases in homelessness. But we already have a system for helping low-income renters, the Federal Housing Choice Voucher Program. If housing assistance were available to everyone who qualified before the pandemic, families could have more easily have navigated the sudden job loss, and landlords could have consistently covered their expenses. The program would have provided us a social insurance against exactly the type of problem the country is facing right now. It's time that we reinforce the housing safety net by adopting universal housing vouchers to provide assistance to everyone who needs it. Using our analysis of transfers, taxes, and income security tool, we modeled expanding the Housing Choice Voucher Program to everyone who's currently eligible. We found that this expansion would cover an additional 19.7 million people in 8.2 million households. The average household subsidy cost for new recipients would be $628 per month, or about $7,500 per year. The total cost annually for expansion would be $62 billion per year. Expanding housing assistance to all those who qualify would have sweeping and far-reaching benefits. Homelessness would be rare, and if it occurred, it would be brief. Universal vouchers could reduce poverty and close racial disparities in housing and homelessness. Implementation will need to be closely monitored, but the housing market would likely absorb a significant expansion of vouchers and would benefit landlords. Implementation of a major voucher expansion will matter, and we can optimize the program to ensure all participants benefit by, first, targeting new vouchers to those who are most vulnerable. Second, including source of income protections and adopting small area fair market rents. And third, providing housing search assistance and navigation assistance. Finally, a significant investment in housing vouchers should be a component of a comprehensive housing strategy that includes incentives for land use and zoning reform at the local and state level, and investments in the development of new affordable units. The pandemic is first a health crisis, but the remedy to curtail transmission relied heavily on social distancing and staying home, reminding us of the importance of housing. Unfortunately, the country's housing infrastructure and safety net have long been neglected and stressed beyond measure, leaving far too many people unprotected. We have long lived with the shame of homelessness and serial evictions, and I hope we can see now the devastating impacts of continued disinvestment in housing. As vaccination rates rise and the country begins to return to normal, we have an opportunity to redefine that normal. Let's not make homelessness a part of our future. Research clearly shows that the adoption of universal housing vouchers could bring significant and far-reaching benefits, and it's for these reasons that I support universal adoption. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cunningham. Next, we will go to Mr. Metcalf. You are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, members of the committee, I'm pleased to join you today. My name is Ben Metcalf. I am the Managing Director of the Turner Center for Housing Innovation. I also speak today from the perspective of having run the state of California's housing department and from having overseen multifamily housing programs for HUD during the Obama administration. First, let me affirm what we have already heard today. Wages for those below the median income have not kept pace with rising housing costs. We see growing numbers of households with limited ability to afford the food, the health care, their children's education, save for retirement. This is true nationally. It's particularly true for California, where I call home, which sits at the bleeding edge of the nation's housing challenges. Even during the pandemic, when housing costs were dropping nationally, California renters have still seen a 12% increase in average rent prices. The housing crisis is also translating into a growing homelessness crisis. 2020 marked the 4th consecutive year homelessness rose, with the growth entirely in the unsheltered population. And in addition to the toll on individuals and families, rising housing costs in economically productive areas of this country do negatively impact employment growth and productivity. By one estimate, it may be as much as $1.6 trillion a year that's lost in wages and productivity from this housing crisis. The answer to all these challenges is clearly an expansion of federal housing assistance through both demand and supply side subsidies. These investments work. The research shows it. Individuals with rental assistance are less likely to experience homelessness, housing instability, unsafe housing conditions, and they invest in their own economic mobility as well as that of their children. Housing vouchers in particular serve the most vulnerable in our society, and they give the recipients a unique ability to choose the kinds of housing and locations that best meet their needs. Furthermore, vouchers do already serve an important complement to the resources that local and state governments use to build more housing. As an example, in 2017, California enacted No Place Like Home, a $2 billion bond-funded program to help construct new permanent supportive housing for formerly homeless individuals. But without available adequate federal vouchers, the state was compelled to use those funds to build fewer units than would have otherwise been possible because of the requirement to capitalize large operating subsidy reserves. The upshot was local funds that could have been used to build more housing sit idle in project bank accounts as operating reserves. A universal voucher expansion, therefore, does offer transformative benefits to these various housing and social challenges. But I would offer that to maximize that increased investment into the voucher program, some reforms are recommended. Let me identify 5 in particular. First, we need to accelerate deployment of known fixes to the voucher program. This includes updating HUD's process for setting fair market rents, making the current physical inspection program easier to use for owners, making it harder to directly or indirectly discriminate against voucher holders who seek to rent housing, and investing heavily in renter counseling and landlord outreach. Second, it should go without saying that any incremental new vouchers should be prioritized for those most vulnerable households. We've seen the incredible benefits that accrue to formerly homeless individuals or other extremely low incomes when they access these vouchers, and this can be done in alignment with state and local housing priorities. Third, I would suggest that this expansion should be accompanied with a targeted renter's tax credit for those who are approaching a phase out of eligibility. A targeted tax credit would ensure expanded assistance avoids either the challenges of a subsidy cliff or asset limits where renters lose their assistance if their income goes too high. Fourth, we do need to mandate capacity standards for the voucher administering entities and enable new vouchers to be administered by the same entities that currently oversee state and local affordable housing programs whenever possible. The current system requires HUD to work through thousands of voucher administering public housing authorities with various capacity. In addition, PHAs often sit outside of the mainstream affordable housing capital delivery structure. HUD should have the flexibility to allocate new vouchers to states or regional governments or other non-traditional entities. And fifth, and most importantly, we do need to pair vouchers with a robust production-oriented strategy. This requires the federal government to work constructively with local governments to eliminate exclusionary zoning, harmful land use policies, as has been proposed under the President's jobs plan. It also requires a larger share of those new housing vouchers to be project-based into new rental housing communities. For traditional affordable housing, additional debt from project-based vouchers is used to close funding gaps, but an expanded voucher program should also be used to spur market rate construction, pairing new vouchers with expanded federal investments into programs used by market rate developers. In summary, for these reasons, I support expansion of the voucher program and encourage the committee to consider some of the program reforms that I have mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Metcalf. Next, we will go to Ms. Al-Mansour. You are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Hello, and thank you. I want to thank you for the opportunity to address the important issue of homelessness in America, and in particular, the Universal Voucher Program and their capacity to end homelessness and to expand economic opportunity in America, and also to stress the importance of the End Homelessness Act that was raised by Honorable Representative Congresswoman Maxine Waters. And if I have time, I'd like to address one of the earlier issues that was raised about the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, of which I know something about, so I'll try to speak rather quickly. I'm Chance Al-Mansour. For the past 10 years, I've served as Executive Director of the Housing Rights Center. Before joining the Housing Rights Center, I was a legal aid attorney for 18 years. I was involved in the Homelessness Prevention Rapid Recovery Housing Project of 2009 that was used to address the previous economic fallout. I also serve on the boards of the California Reinvestment Coalition and the National Fair Housing Alliance, and I'm very much involved in homelessness prevention issues in California and Los Angeles. In particular, I'm very proud because I served on the Los Angeles Homeless Service Agency's committee ad hoc committee on Black people experiencing homelessness and on the committee on women experiencing homelessness. And so, and I myself do have personal lived experience with housing instability as well. And so it's with this combined experience and as a representative of the Housing Rights Center that I provide this opportunity to support a universal program and its importance in decreasing household expenses, and in particular rent, because as you've heard in other testimony, rent often consumes more than 50% of monthly household income. Universal vouchers would provide necessary housing security because due to the COVID-19 pandemic and its harsh economic impact on low-income communities, particular women-headed households, over 12 million families with children are at risk of losing their housing due to an eviction. The vast problems caused by COVID-19 and the affordability of housing in many communities that existed prior to the pandemic and the ongoing impact and intersection of race and wage and wealth disparities require financial and ideological commitment to immediate and coordinated and hopefully permanent solutions. So the first step towards eliminating housing insecurity is adequately investing in federal housing assistance. In Los Angeles, the need for permanent rental assistance is severe. Approximately 60% of Los Angeles's over 800,000 renter households have incomes that are below 80% of AMI. The estimate from the city's housing department measured before the pandemic was that more than 21% of renters are now were severely in arrears due to the loss of income. The Section 8 program for the city of Los Angeles is not accepting applications, and the waitlist has been closed for is oftentimes closed for several years before new applications are accepted. Applications oftentimes take several months to process, not due to the fault of sometimes of the process, but oftentimes because tenants have a hard time getting their histories, their credit stats and things like that from previous landlords, from previous employers and things like that in order to prove eligibility. And sometimes some applications do go unused, a few do, but not because they're not needed, they're very much needed, but they especially go unused for Black households where Section 8 housing vouchers are turned away when they're not protected by anti-discrimination laws. As some landlords will, even in California, where Section 8 discrimination is now prohibited, and as it has been since last year, some landlords do still try to circumvent the law, and we have found through investigations. So it is also very important not only to make Section 8 vouchers mandatory, but also to make the participation in the Section 8 program mandatory as well, and also to fund the investigation to ensure that discrimination against Section 8 vouchers and Section 8 participants does not continue. Even before the adverse impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable communities, we saw this as well. Discrimination also occurs against families against HOPWA vouchers. Those are the vouchers for persons living with AIDS. And there's discrimination against LGBT communities, against VASH vouchers, against discrimination against militaries and veterans, and against female-headed households as well. High rents in California and so forth have reduced the availability of affordable housing, and also housing prices have gone up with the pandemic. They have not gone down, which has severely reduced the availability of housing, further impacting the loss of affordable housing because everybody is competing for this housing. In closing, a federally declared eviction moratorium in eviction, in addition to the emergency rental assistance programs, have helped to curb the immediate disaster of increased homelessness and housing insecurity for many, but these items of relief don't extend to all who are eligible and will end soon. So low-income families with children, seniors on fixed incomes, and persons with disabilities need a universal voucher program to ensure housing stability and to end homelessness for all. Thank you. And unfortunately, I did run out of time about the emergency rental assistance program, but I can't speak to that. Thank you.
You are recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony. Mr. Husak, you are recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony. Is Mr. Husak on the platform? Oh, there you are. You're recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry and members of the committee. I'm Howard Husak. I'm an adjunct scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Prior to that, I served as research vice president at the Manhattan Institute and director of case studies in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Too many low-income households find it difficult to afford housing. At the same time, an entitlement-based approach to housing assistance risks overpromising and underdelivering. At the same time, there are common sense adjustments to the current housing voucher program that can increase its reach without major new spending while providing incentives and encouragement for low-income households to improve their economic status. First, a comparison. We can all remember just a few months ago when the coronavirus vaccine had miraculously become available, but millions found themselves qualified to receive the shot and unable to schedule an appointment. Demand was far higher than supply. This has long been a characteristic of our low-income housing markets, a function of overly restrictive zoning laws and building codes, among other things. But providing, in effect, a check that can only be used for one purpose, rental housing, provides no assurance that additional supply will come online or that voucher holders will be able to find an available unit. Indeed, even at the current appropriation level, a 2019 report by the Center for Budget Policy and Priorities stated, low success rates among families that receive housing vouchers remain a legitimate and serious concern. A universal housing voucher risks increasing the number of locations where this problem will exist. A new entitlement program may simply put more low-income households in competition with each other for few available units without addressing the fundamental supply issue affecting our housing markets today. Fundamentally, low-income households face an income problem. Providing a coupon that can be used only for rental assistance limits how they can use this new income while failing to address the root causes of why that income is so low in the first place. We must not forget the steps it takes to truly encourage economic upward mobility for poor households, improve skills training for the 21st century, ensuring that every child has access to a high-quality public education, and reducing discriminatory racial barriers. But we can and should make some common sense adjustment to the current housing voucher program. We shouldn't assume that poverty is a life sentence in America. We should build on the lessons we've learned from successful welfare reform efforts in the 1990s. This suggests that we employ vouchers not on a permanent basis, but as a transitional program. This leads me to two proposals. First, allow voucher households to sign the same type of rental leases as non-subsidized households enjoy, a flat rent for a fixed period. As it stands, a voucher or public housing tenant, as they earn more money, they pay more rent, 34 cents on each dollar. This has all sorts of ill effects, discouraging finding a higher paying job, forming two-income families, and building savings. To better use our housing vouchers, we should follow the example of the Delaware State Housing Authority, which, as part of its Moving to Work program, combines capped rent and savings account escrows with a 5-year ceiling on assistance. A similar program has been adopted by the Housing Authority of San Bernardino, California, which specifically sets out as a key goal the encouragement of tenant economic independence, including what it calls a shift from, quote, entitlement to empowerment. They've seen positive results regarding employment and income. I'll be glad to discuss those in detail. Of course, as households move out and up, so too do voucher units become available for other needy families. This healthy turnover should be a core part of the voucher program. Poverty should not be viewed as inevitable, nor should entitlements be seen as universally needed without limit. As matters stand, HUD reports an 8% turnover rate annually among voucher units. That's been as high as 15% in some other years. Increasing turnover while improving the economic situation of voucher households should be key goals of the program. As President Biden has emphasized, we're in the midst of a wonderful economic recovery, and many have lamented the drag that our labor market shortages are putting on that. This is the time to use our housing voucher program in the context of encouraging improved job skills and household savings, so Americans get through the voucher program what Lyndon Johnson called a hand up. Finally, a word about our homelessness epidemic. While it is tempting to conclude that the streets of Los Angeles are filled with homeless encampments because of a failure of the housing market, we know that far too many of these street sleepers suffer from untreated mental illness and substance abuse and may not be ready to maintain an independent household. We are failing to provide the services and compassionate program they need and deserve. A universal voucher entitlement is not the answer to those in need on the streets of Los Angeles, Manhattan, Portland, and Seattle. Rather, we should be discussing improved treatment and adjustments to Medicaid policy. Equating housing policy with the issues of those sleeping on the street will not put us on the right path forward. It's an honor to testify in front of the committee today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very, very much. I would like to address my questions to Mr. Husak. You just hit on something I've been talking with my staff about. You heard the description of homelessness in Los Angeles, particularly as it relates to Black and people of color. And so I have been talking with the county, and I wanted to know from the county in that portion of my district, who is responsible for dealing with the encampments under the bridges, on the sidewalks, And who is it that is addressing the mental health problem? No one seems to be dealing with that. And if you were, what would you do with all of those people who are have mental problems? And it seems that no one's really addressing that. And given that I want universal vouchers, absolutely. What good will they do for those who are in those encampments who have mental problems that are not being addressed by the county or the city or LAHSA?
Boy, I strongly agree with the thrust of the chairwoman's remarks, and my heart goes out to those people and to the people of Los Angeles who face the Skid Row encampments. You know, Medicaid, when it was passed, had a fatal flaw that we still live with. Medicaid cannot be received by anybody in a facility with 16 units or more. So if the state of California to use state hospitals, not on an open-ended basis like the old asylums that we had, but as treatment centers till people can get back on their feet, and use a housing voucher if it's appropriate. If they can't manage their affairs, the housing voucher is not going to get them off the streets, I'm afraid. So we need to reform Medicaid. If you're an incarcerated person or a formerly incarcerated person, you are also limited in terms of what Medicaid can provide for you. We need Medicaid to step up and be able to provide support for state facilities that are large enough to take in these thousands of people. Again, not forever. I'm not saying we have the old asylums back forever, but we need something at least on an interim basis for those many people. That's one idea.
Well, thank you so very much. And I will now turn to Mr. Metcalf and Ms. Oliva. Many of the low-income families and individuals who would benefit from a universal housing voucher also have significant health needs, including mental health or substance addiction challenges or other kinds of disabilities. Mr. Metcalf, Ms. Oliva, you both administered HUD programs that serve these populations and are familiar with some of the challenges that exist in terms of localities, in terms of states and localities aligning their house and healthcare system. So how do we align the housing and healthcare systems? You just alluded to it, Mr. Husak. Do you have any additional thoughts about it? First, Mr. Metcalf.
Thank you. So the state of California, I think, is a great example of a state that has been able to get Medicaid waiver authority to be able to deploy those healthcare resources in tandem with its housing resources. So that includes getting somebody into a permanent housing situation, but then wrapping around them with services that provide for the intensive case management, assistance with getting housed in the first place, addressing things like onerous security deposits. I think it's all doable. I think we have great models for it, but we again and again run into the limiting factors on the one hand of bringing up housing assistance to deploy, and on the other hand, having to navigate the contours of these waiver provisions on Medicaid. Both of those are solvable issues.
Thank you very much. Let me get back to Ms. Olivia. I was going to ask you something about aligning healthcare systems with the vouchers, but since you've had so much experience, I want to know who in Los Angeles County is going down Vermont and major streets where the encampments are in the medians, on the sidewalks, under the bridges. Who is going and dealing with those people?
Thank you for that question, Chairwoman Waters. You know, I do spend quite a bit of time in Los Angeles, or was spending a lot of time in Los Angeles before the pandemic. And I think this really has to be a partnership between LAHSA, the city, and the county. In particular, outreach workers need to be armed with not just bottles of water, but they actually have to be able to access housing resources in order to help people who are living on the street access both the services that they need and the housing resources that will help them actually become healthy and end their homelessness.
Thank you very much. I've exhausted my question time. I now recognize Mr. McHenry for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Look, Mr. Husak, I'll start with you. Look, last year, Congress provided $25 billion in emergency rental assistance. we've added an additional 21 billion added to that 26 billion, 25 billion. So we have $46 billion for rental assistance. And the Treasury has indicated they have no clue what's happened to these funds. And it seems to me that there's been a slow walking of the rules. We don't know if any renters actually had their past rent debts fully paid, according to congressional intent. What are the challenges that the average renter who has arrears is facing? Do they even know that this money is available?
Well, it's not just the renters. There are many, we have this image of the landlord as Daddy Warbucks, but there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of poor minority immigrant and African-American property owners who rely on rental income to pay their own bills, to pay the repair people who maintain their units. Those funds ripple through low-income communities. And so when the rent stops, whole parts of low-income economies stop. So the landlords may not be aware that they're qualified. They want that money. But they may be outside of the reach of bureaucratic programs. I suspect that's definitely true. So we need some promotional activities, just like we promote vaccine use. Let's promote the idea that if you're a property owner and you are owed arrears, you can qualify and tell your tenants. We need to do that. And let's not kid ourselves that these landlords have lots of choices and they're keen to evict people, that we have a looming eviction crisis. Do we really think that they're going to kick people out because they have so many people waiting to pay the rent? Not necessarily. Everybody's been hit so hard. So landlords are under pressure.
Ms. Almansour, how would you respond to this question? I mean, we obviously have a massive holdup here. We have $46 billion allocated. There's obviously some challenges within the system to get this money out. How should we deal with this, and how do we fix the problem?
So first of all, I can only speak to what has happened in Los Angeles and in part in Los Angeles County. So it's significant, but I can't speak nationally. In terms of the first round, the CARES Act funding, the money was spent. The state of Los Angeles was awarded about $97 million in emergency rental assistance, and every single dollar of that went to landlords to pay rental assistance. There were a lot of challenges to the program, but the challenges aren't the ones that you think. The challenges have to do with the fact that tenants, these programs went to low-income tenants. A lot of low-income tenants, for example, don't have bank accounts and things like that. They didn't have landlords who wanted to participate in the program. We have a lot of landlords, and I agree, there are a lot of landlords who are struggling right now to pay their mortgages. But some landlords are refusing this assistance.
Ms. Almansour, you said the first tranche of money from the CARES Act was deployed. What about the second batch, this $21.6 billion? What's the holdup here?
So in Los Angeles also, landlords are being paid, applications are being processed. Again, I can't speak to what's happening, everywhere, but part of it has to do, if there is hesitation, a lot of it does have to do with there is, again, some hesitation of landlords wanting to participate in the program. We think for a few different reasons. One, because some landlords are holding out for 100% of the back rent to be paid, not just a part of it. So there's that. There's also the fact that there is discrimination that goes on. There's some landlords who value their rental unit more than their tenant, and some of them would prefer to have the tenant leave, especially if it's a rent restricted unit, in order to be able to raise the rent with incoming tenants.
You obviously keep detailed track of where this money is deployed. What we're seeing is across the country an unequal deployment. We have at the federal response a lack of information of where the money is going. So what I'm hearing from you is that you're paying close attention to this money, but as a federal office holder and as a policymaker, I don't have the same data, and we're not getting the same data as Congress as you were providing us today. So thank you for your testimony. Finally, Madam Chair, when we have 9 million unfilled jobs this last month, we need to help get people back to work. And I think that will have a far more beneficial impact than some new government program. Thank you all for your testimony. Yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Cunningham, according to a report issued by HUD in 2018, low levels of landlord participation and low acceptance of vouchers has resulted in diminished lease-up rates and a decreased likelihood that households are able to use their vouchers within the allotted time. Last month, Senators Coons and Kramer introduced bipartisan legislation, the Choice and Affordable Housing Act, which seeks to increase landlord acceptance of vouchers by putting in place stronger incentives. As we seek to expand the availability of housing choice vouchers, it would seem that we need to make sure that we have the tools in place to ensure voucher holders are actually able to use them to acquire rental housing. In general, do you agree that there is more that we can be doing to expand private sector participation and make sure that these vouchers actually turn into a real housing unit?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I do agree that there's more that we can be doing. I think that the Housing Choice Voucher Program is a public-private partnership. And that private partnership really relies on landlords participating in the program. And the Urban Institute, actually, I've led a study that looked at landlord discrimination against voucher holders. And we found that in many places, Los Angeles, for example, landlords rejected voucher holders at a rate of 76%. In Fort Worth, 78%. And places like Washington, D.C., where there are source of income protections that actually prohibit discrimination against voucher holders, those rates of rejection are much lower, hovering around 15%. So still some rejection, but much, much lower. So I think the first thing that we need to do to encourage landlord participation is to adopt source of income protections and prohibit discrimination against voucher holders. I think that's sort of the stick. I think we should also offer carrots. So incentives to landlords to participate in the program, making sure that the program is easy to use, making inspections less difficult, setting rents at competitive rates using small area FMRs, and basically just improving the overall management. There are some housing authorities that are very high performing, that have very high rates of success, as well as high rates of landlord participation. Landlords actually in this study asked, which housing authority are you presenting your voucher from? And they cared because the management of the program really matters. So they would take some vouchers from some housing authorities and not others. So I agree, this is a public-private partnership and it's important.
Let me get in one more question. Ms. Olivia, in your written testimony, you note that expanding the availability of housing choice vouchers should, in your words, create an environment where partners like continuum of care entities and public housing authorities work together to prevent and end homelessness. I'd like to draw your attention to the Homelessness Assistance Act, which I want to thank Chair Waters for putting in the list of bills we're considering today. I introduced this bill, I believe, last year. It passed overwhelmingly on the floor of the House, but we need to pass it again. The bill would empower local public housing authorities to share where appropriate with other local government agencies and with nonprofits engaged in the continuum of care program. Currently, often that information cannot be shared, and as a result, the homeless person or previously homeless person is not getting the continuum of care that they need. So this bill is a tailored exemption to the Federal Privacy Act to allow public housing authorities to share some of their data with continuum of care organizations. Would you agree that increasing data sharing among those trying to provide help to the previously homeless and the homeless insecure is an important step to take.
So thank you so much for that question, Congressman. I would say a couple of things are important to point to as I respond to that question. The first is that data sharing is an important process between different kinds of organizations who are all serving the same person in many cases.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe I may be up next for questioning. Is the chairwoman available? Would the vice chair like to recognize me?
Ms. Wagner, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman and my friend from Missouri. Mr. Husick, one of the largest drivers of unaffordability in the housing market is the shortage of housing in our country. Major metropolitan areas have become extremely expensive because many cities and states actively disincentivize development of new units of housing. Would creating a new housing voucher entitlement address this issue?
No, that's exactly the point, that it would not. And we need to persuade localities. First of all, we're in the midst of a huge sea change in housing markets because of the remote work possibility. So as the gentleman from the Turner Center pointed out, there'd been this tremendous pressure on the California housing markets that led to income inequality because of the inability of people to partake in the growth areas. Now that's changing. Rents in San Francisco are going down. And so the whole thing is kind of up in the air right now, but still, we need to persuade localities. That's where it is. States control. Yeah.
Let me be clear. So flooding our private housing markets with federal dollars for rental assistance it would only further drive up the cost of housing and do nothing to increase what I would say the supply of housing. Am I correct?
Yeah, and look to California's environmental policy laws, which do incredible delays. So yes, because of those kind of barriers, you are exactly right.
So what policy changes do you believe would create more affordable and available housing in America? You talked about some of the environmental factors, certainly in California, but what else? How do we solve this? We've got a huge supply issue right now. Throwing more federal entitlement money at it is only going to drive up the cost and not solve the shortage problem. How do we handle this, do you think, Mr.
Well, in the short term, we have to get rid of tariffs on Canadian lumber because there's a lumber shortage, even when you are allowed to go. But that's a small thing. A big thing right now for home builders. But number two, this is up to all of our communities. All of us need to talk to our local planning boards and say, do you want your kids to be able to live in the towns where they grew up? Do you want your teachers and your police and your firefighters to be able to live in the towns where they work? You have to allow for naturally occurring affordable housing. How does that happen? Smaller homes on smaller lots. The Levittown homes of the 50s, 750 square feet. We don't build any homes like that anymore, but people lap them up. We need our planning boards to take action.
Mr. Husick, participation in the Housing Choice Vouchers program is mostly voluntary for private landlords. We've talked about that. But if this program were to become an entitlement, it would likely become mandatory for landlord participation. For what business reasons would a landlord choose not to participate in this program?
Well, if you're only going to get so much rent, you want to make sure you get that rent. And remember, the tenants are on the hook for 30% of the rent. And so anybody who's in business is going to look at the credit scores of those individuals. They may look at the family structure and see, I'm worried about renting to children because they may damage the property. I have been a landlord and I've rented to children. I don't sympathize with that point of view, but it's a point of view. So I think credit scores and the ability to pay would be the biggest deterrence to renting that would still be legal.
If they did not want to participate, would they likely raise the cost of their units above HUD's fair market rents?
I'm not sure they would have that flexibility. A lot of those who participate in the Choice Voucher Program are lower middle class neighborhoods typically. They're not going to Beverly Hills. They're going to San Bernardino, in the California context. It's possible they would raise rents if they could, but they may not be able to. Typically,
I'm just wondering how this would impact the cost of housing for everyone else, potentially.
Well, yes, it could drive up if anytime you increase demand and you don't increase supply, you don't have to be Ben Bernanke to know what happens.
Yeah, well, we're seeing that all over the country. The housing shortage is a real problem that we have across the board. So I thank you for your testimony. I appreciate the chairwoman putting this hearing together, and I will yield back the remainder of my time. It looks like Chairwoman Waters is up and running.
Back. We're back. We have some technical difficulties, but I think they've been cleared up now. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, who is also the chair of the House Agricultural Committee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady, for this very, very important and critical hearing here. Make no mistake about it, ladies and gentlemen. Let's cut right to the chase. We need these vouchers. Expert research shows that housing vouchers prevent homelessness. Our homeless population is spreading all across our nation. And the last thing we need is discrimination against the very people who need them. Discrimination against the people who use these vouchers has curtailed what little progress we've made with the homeless. But this is the tool we need to use. So, Mr. Metcalf, let me go to you, because we need to find out from this hearing what we and the Financial Services Committee can do. Our job, paramount, is to legislate these effective means of helping cure this nation of this homeless crisis. So, Mr. Metcalf, can you explain how a federal or national universal solution banning housing voucher discrimination would benefit our struggling families?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. Ms. Cunningham spoke to this briefly, but there is good evidence to show that once you have in place a source of income discrimination law that prevents people from choosing not to rent to voucher holders, the ability of those voucher holders to access housing gets much more effective, and they're able to access homes in locations that otherwise might have been closed off to them. I think to your earlier point, obviously this universal voucher program would in one fell swoop make vast inroads against our homeless situation. And I also think, and I have suggested in my testimony, that a universal housing voucher will be very effective in terms of stimulating new housing construction. It will allow builders to rely on income streams that before they hadn't, to be able to leverage additional debt to pay for investments into new housing supply.
Now, let me go to you, Ms. Cunningham. The Urban Institute has recommended greater investment in recruiting landlords in middle-income and wealthier neighborhoods to participate in the voucher program. Tell us, what has been the response from these middle-income and wealthier neighborhoods with landlords that are considering participating in these voucher programs?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Our studies have found that landlords who have apartments or units in lower poverty neighborhoods or neighborhoods that we might label opportunity neighborhoods actually have lower participation. They're more likely to say no to voucher holders. The challenge with that is that we know from really strong evidence that if we can help voucher holders access opportunity neighborhoods, that they actually can improve their life chances and outcomes, increase their economic mobility. Kids have higher rates of educational attainment and higher lifetime earnings if they can move to those better neighborhoods. And vouchers can help them get them there. We just need more participation from landlords and better assistance in helping families move to those neighborhoods.
Now, what do you suggest? We have a variety of pieces of legislation dealing with this coming to bear. The discrimination, making sure we've got the level of money. Now, to address this issue, I want you to know that 20 states and cities like Atlanta passed laws requiring landlords to treat voucher holders the same as they would any applicant. Now, are we making progress on that? And should this be incorporated in a national law?
Yeah, there are local, as you noted, local state and local protections. Only 1 out of 3 voucher holders are protected, and we need national protections to make sure that every voucher doesn't have to face discrimination from landlords.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing today. Mr. Husick, do you agree that we ought to address alternatives or incentives for bringing down the cost of construction housing, including multifamily housing, so that we can meet the needs of affordable counties?
Yeah, so of course we have to do that. And one of the ways that we can do that is through local zoning, local building codes. Builders talk about equivalencies. So in San Diego, there was an effort to build single room occupancy hotels, so-called single room occupancy buildings. They had to get equivalency waivers from the fire chief to have microwave ovens in the room so the gentleman could use them or the people could use them. These are common sense changes that can be very impactful. So localities need to look at their building codes, look at their zoning codes, and ask the question, how can I facilitate rather than block new multifamily construction?
Good. Thank you. I appreciate that. Can you recommend any housing or apartment construction technologies that Congress might be able to encourage to bring down the housing costs and the benefit of the homeless?
I have to say I'm not an expert on construction, so I'll have to dodge that question.
Okay. Do you think it would be advisable for the state and local programs to have any matching requirements so that they might have some skin in the game to help encourage incentives to expand the supply?
In terms of their receipt of housing vouchers, or what you're referring to specifically?
Any of the above. I mean, do you see a role where, I mean, oftentimes we talk about, the NIMBYs don't want to have construction near them that doesn't meet whatever standard they think is in their best interest.
Yeah, and a Democratic senator from California, Scott Wiener, is part of a YIMBY movement, which I don't agree with him on everything, but that's the right attitude, which is, can we have model zoning that the states can present to their locality, say, you do it this way, and things are going to get to be a less tight housing market. So I think states, and HUD for that matter, have a role in modeling the right kind of zoning that'll permit new construction. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the chairwoman's had a number of hearings on this issue. I mean, we find there's cases where you have to have 2 parking places, for.
That's right, absolutely.
For a homeless occupant. I mean, that really doesn't make good sense. It's, how do we encourage local and state governments to get more engaged?
Yeah, the parking requirement is a particularly onerous one in California specifically, and communities are beginning to look at that. I just return quickly to Chairwoman Waters' such a great question about the street homelessness. California had 50,000 units of hospital space for the mentally troubled in 1955. Today it has 5,000. So it's no wonder we have all these people on the street. I'm not saying we need 50,000, but we need more than we have.
Listen, I appreciate your answers, and I yield back to balance my time.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green. Mr. Green, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I support the Ending Homeless Act of 2021. The discussion draft is something that I've had an opportunity to peruse. A discussion draft is just that. It can be improved upon. There may be some amendments to it, but the concept is something that I clearly support. And I'd like to hearken back, if I may, to Social Security, 1935, January. It passed the House, didn't have unanimous consent, passed the Senate, didn't have unanimous consent. Some of the debate included this would be discriminatory. There would be people who would receive it and some who wouldn't. Another debate, it would work a great injustice in a number of states that are also bankrupt or nearly so. And here's one that I am ashamed of. There were those who said it was a foolish gesture to pass Social Security. Well, I would dare say no one would want to end Social Security. Well, let me share this. A good many don't want to. There may be some who would. But Social Security has been a great benefit to us. Medicare. Medicare passed in 1965, didn't pass unanimously. 313 yeas, 115 nays in the House, 5 not voting. Senate, 68 yeas, 21 nays, 11 not voting. I don't believe that we will get unanimity, but I do believe that on the things that are important, the big things that can make a difference in the lives of people, we should move forward with them. I was a judge of a small claims justice court for a quarter of a century. I conducted hearings for people who had mental health problems, and we would help them to get stabilized. But if they were living on the street, they go back to the street. They didn't have a place to call home. They didn't have an anchor. They didn't have something that they would be looking forward to, and we could find them if we needed to. They'd go to another location. People who are on the street and they suffer with diabetes, they go to the emergency room, they get stability, they go back to the streets, and we have to then find them again. The cost of homelessness is far greater than the cost of providing shelter for people in a place that I would call home. I've been to Skid Row. I was there with the chairwoman. I have seen what it is like to be on Skid Row. And Skid Row is coming to my community in Houston, Texas. It's probably coming to a good many other communities around this country. So Skid Row is not just a place for us to assume is going to remain in somebody else's area. It's going to be around the country. I see no plan better than this plan to end homelessness, and I'm going to support it. And I do have a question. What alternative is going to be superior to putting a person in a home where that person can then have all of the other needs addressed? We've had intellectuals to appear before us and indicated to us that the genesis of solving a good many of these problems is a place to call home. So let me just start with, if I may, Mr. Husak, I believe is your name, sir. And I'm not going to be able to give you all of my time, but you've spoken quite well this morning, and I greatly appreciate it. So, Mr. Husak, what do we do that's better than having a place in a house? Now, look, I understand that there are all kinds of problems with dealing with it. You got building codes. I understand these things. But do you see people in homes having the benefit of being able to move into other things that can benefit them with their mental health, with their stability in life, so that they can get a job, apply for a job, and you've got a place that you can identify with as your home?
Thank you so much for that excellent question, Congressman. We have a program called Housing First in HUD, which thinks that that's the most important thing. First is a house. I think we need treatment first. We need treatment in treatment facilities, and then when people graduate and they're ready to go into the housing market.
Let me respond to you. Let's assume that we have the treatment. We will still need to have the house at the home at some point, is what you're saying. So let me go to another person. Thank you much. Let's go to Ms. Cunningham. Ms. Cunningham, a place to call home. How does that address these other problems?
It helps people provide stability so that they can work on those other problems. So you can't work on your drug or substance use issue or mental health issues while you're sleeping in a tent. If you have a house, then you have a platform that's stable that you can work from, and the data shows that you can improve your outcomes.
I'll have to yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the time.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just wanted to comment. I see the gentleman from Missouri, the distinguished chairman of the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee. He and I, a few years ago, when I was chairman of that committee, put together a bill that made over 60 changes to HUD, which I think today are reaping a lot of benefits. And that was a bipartisan effort that we were able to get a lot of work done. And I want to commend him for, and again, remember, help folks remember that this can be done. But this morning, we're talking about a little bit different subject here in a way. You know, one of the things we've already talked about here is the overall lack of housing. One of the comments that I think we've had in previous hearings have been that 25% of the cost of building a home or apartments in these cities sometimes is due to local regulations. Mr. Husak, is that a reasonable figure? I mean, is that about right that you've heard of before?
Well, it varies tremendously. It's higher than that in New York. I've read 40% in New York. It's higher than that in California. It's lower than that in Houston, Texas, and that's why you have so much housing construction in the state of Texas. But the fundamental thrust of your question, absolutely, that does add on.
You know, so the cost of housing. I think one of the comments made earlier was that, you know, because of the increasing cost of housing and building of apartment houses, multi-unit buildings as well, it raises the cost beyond the ability of people to pay for it. And that's why a lot of them are going to need some additional help and rental assistance, vouchers, whatever here. So, but then we've come to some discussions point here that are really kind of in my own mind, I'm kind of wondering a little bit about. I think Ms. Al-Mansour made the comment to the effect that there's some landlords that don't participate in a voucher program. I think Ms. Cunningham made the comment a few minutes ago as well that you even find a lot of people, a lot of landlords not participating in low and moderate income areas. So Ms. Cunningham, I guess my question to you was, why are some folks who actually are setting up shop, they have their business, they have their apartment buildings in the low and moderate income areas not participating in a voucher program? Do we need to change the program around, provide some incentives?
I think we do need to provide some incentives. I think there's a lot of reasons why landlords don't participate. I will say that many of the landlords that have participated in the Housing Choice Voucher Program during the pandemic have found positive experiences. And I think that landlords actually need to have incentives, like you said. And so thinking about either offering some financial assistance, making it easier by waiving or expediting inspections would all be helpful. But I also think some landlords discriminate against voucher holders. And I think we heard a little bit of that earlier. Many voucher holders have children. There's a lot of stigma around voucher holders that isn't true. And so I think landlords also discriminate, and we need to have protections against that discrimination.
And thank you. This is Chance Al-Mansour. I'd like to address that issue also, and I thank Representative Wagner for raising that. The main reason why we get that landlords don't participate in the Section 8 program is because they say they don't want the involvement of the government. They want the government in their property, doing inspections, looking over their reports, watching, making sure they don't discriminate against their tenants, making sure they do repairs on time. They don't want that oversight. And what do we say to those landlords? you are already in the business of providing housing. Anytime you're in a business, there's going to be some government oversight, and whether it's a restaurant or anything else. And so that's one of the main reasons we get, and in terms of why landlords don't want to participate, they don't want the government intrusion into their business of providing rental housing. And the other thing, yes, is discrimination. At the Housing Rights Center, we are investigating discrimination against Black tenants who have Section 8 vouchers, and they've been discriminated against. In the San Fernando Valley, we had an apartment building where there were 6 tenants who lived there. They'd all been there for years. California changed the state law, City of LA did, mandating the owner accept Section 8. The owner accepted it from the one white tenant, but not from the Black tenants until we got involved. And they were they were already in place. Because we believe the owner wanted them not to be able to afford the apartment ultimately, so that they would have to move out. Discrimination against Black tenants is definitely one of the main reasons why landlords don't want to participate in the Section 8 program.
Well, I see no time's about it, but thank you for your responses. Thank you for the witness for being here today. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You were not here earlier when I expressed appreciation for this committee hearing. I appreciate it very much because I think this is critically important. One of my longtime concerns, it goes back years and years and years, actually goes back to my great grandmother who refused to tell people from the census how many children were in a house. She had 18 children. With my grandpa, and so I'm always concerned about the undercount because it damages a lot of things for the least of the people in this country, and so last Congress, then subcommittee chair Lacey Clay and I requested that the GAO investigate best practices for counting the United States homeless population, and communities throughout the country participate in the point-in-time count in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. And although it is a helpful tool in determining the population of those experiencing homelessness, it's not perfect. It does have its limitations. The GAO is currently undergoing work on those recommendations. So I'd like to hear from the panelists while we're talking about the importance of universal vouchers. Are you, first of all, concerned about the count, our ability or inability to count the homeless? How accurate is it? And whether or not you're concerned that the methods we're using may create some additional undercounting, and so we'll never fully find the extent of homelessness, and then we don't know how to solve the problem, and it's going to be difficult to get resources. I'd like to have all the panelists to respond to that, please.
I'd be happy to start. Thank you so much for that question, Congressman. I used to run the program or the office at HUD that runs the point-in-time count. So I want to just note a couple of things. It's important to know that the point-in-time count is just that. It is a snapshot every year of what's happening on a single night in January. And therefore, it does have some limitations, which is why most of us in the field actually use multiple types of data sets in order to really understand what is happening with regards to homelessness. So we look at the number of households that are at risk or who are paying more than 50% of their income in rent. We look at the number of households that are experiencing homelessness at a point in time, but we also look at data for who's using homeless services over the course of a year to really try and understand what the flow is through the system. And then we look at the Department of Education data, which also has its own limitations because it really only captures school-aged children. So I think it's important for us to make sure that when we're talking about universal vouchers, that we're aware of all of these different types of data sets and are using them in order to create a comprehensive approach.
Okay, Miss Cecilia, if you don't mind, I have to call you Miss Chancellor, so that I won't continue to assassinate the pronunciation of your name. So I'd like to hear from you, please.
Yeah, Chancellor Al-Mansour, thank you very much for your attempt. I appreciate it. So yes, I agree. And Olivia, you pointed to one of the main problems. The point-in-time count, even in Los Angeles, is conducted in January, and that's for good reasons that it's also conducted in January. But even in Los Angeles, on the January night, it can get down to the 30s and the 40s, and there are mountains it can go to freezing. And so that is a time when more people who may have family members or may have friends or maybe church members who feel sorry for them may take them in. So that point in time count probably is the lowest time in which and probably has the fewest number of people experiencing homelessness on the streets. We who do the point in time count, we realize that happens, and we know that the count is way that it's undercounted, that there are many more people who are experiencing homelessness and who are unhoused that are on the streets. And yes, even going to the schools, LAUSD, that doesn't give us a really good number, and we know that it's undercounted in terms of the number of students who are experiencing homelessness who are enrolled in the school system. Younger kids who are experiencing homelessness tend to be more enrolled in the school system, but the dropout rates happen very quickly by the time they reach the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade for a number of reasons, just practical reasons. You know, they have clothes that smell and they're embarrassed and so forth and so forth. They don't have clean clothes to go to school and things like that. So there are many reasons why we know that the point in time count is undercounted, but it's probably the best we can do at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barr. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Husak, I infer from your testimony that you would support the ability of families to use housing choice vouchers in non-housing first facilities. I continue to implore my colleagues to allow vouchers. If we're going to be talking about Section 8 reform, I implore my colleagues to allow our low-income, poor, and homeless families around the country to use vouchers in non-housing first facilities. Last year, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness released a report I commend to all of my colleagues that found that this one-size-fits-all approach to homelessness is not effective, and it has actually led to an increase in the number of unsheltered homeless since the U.S. adopted Housing First as its official policy. In the 5 years after 2014, when the U.S. adopted Housing First as its exclusive solution to combating homelessness, unsheltered homeless increased more than 20%. This is despite significant increases in federal funding to fight homelessness. And this sharp increase came after a welcome decline in homelessness of roughly 31% between 2007 and 2014. The study shows that more money without appropriate policy changes is not the answer. Many transitional housing facilities in my district and around the country do not qualify for federal funds because they require participation in wraparound services such as counseling, financial education, career development, as a condition of continued residency. These requirements are necessary and effective in many cases, such as for individuals recovering from addiction. The facilities have a demonstrated track record of successfully transitioning individuals out of homelessness and into permanent housing, yet they cannot access federal funds or receive housing choice vouchers. Mr. Husak, can you describe the importance that the U.S. embrace an all-of-the-above strategy for fighting homelessness and the potential drawbacks of an exclusive reliance on Housing First, which sidelines safe, effective, and successful homelessness assistance providers?
Thank you very much, Congressman Barr. I strongly agree with the thrust of your remarks and your inference. The fact that treatment facilities cannot receive these kinds of federal supports is antithetical to allowing people to graduate from their problems. And in terms of the count, and I'm going to relate this to your question, there are two types of homelessness, and we should not conflate them. There are what the British call rough sleepers, street sleepers. That is one group of people. They have their own problems. They need their own approaches. There is family homelessness, people who are having a hard time affording their own unit, maybe doubled up with their family. We need to focus on the rough sleepers. That's what people think of as the true homeless, the truly needy, and we need to give them treatment and target any federal funds toward treatment.
Well, we have a terrible addiction crisis in the country and in my home state of Kentucky that is the root cause of much of this homelessness. And I just implore my colleagues, look, if you're an advocate of Housing First, fine. but low-income families should be able to use housing choice vouchers in facilities that reject the failed housing first model. And I would argue the morally bankrupt housing first model and embrace successful models that require services that actually address the underlying cause of homelessness. It's not the lack of a roof over their head. There is a reason why they are homeless. Let's address the reason, the cause, and actually help these people get back on their feet. One other question to you, Mr. Husak. The majority laments the fact that not everyone who qualifies for a voucher receives one. Their solution is to create a new open-ended mandatory autopilot spending program costing taxpayers a minimum of $160 billion per year in perpetuity that would actually make rent less affordable through inflation pressure. But isn't there a better solution? One that costs absolutely nothing and would actually decrease permanent government dependency while making housing choice vouchers more available to more eligible families, and that is reasonable time limits. You mentioned, Mr. Husak, the Delaware model, and how would the imposition of a time limit of housing choice vouchers for able-bodied, work-capable adults without dependents, even a generous time limit like 5 years, increase the availability of housing choice vouchers for families in the waiting line?
The most advanced model in this type is San Bernardino, California. Here's what they found. They report in their new annual report, for those who have been in the 5-year limit program, earned income increased 31%, full-time employment increased 20%, and unemployment decreased 26%. Time limits are not mean.
Thank you. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First, I'd like to say thank you for your compassion that you have towards the homeless and trying to find a solution. I really do appreciate it. I would like to enter, Madam Chair, into the record, and I ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter with which a coalition of bipartisan mayors led by San Diego Mayor Todd Gloria sent to the House and Senate leadership yesterday.
Without objection, such is the order.
Thank you. This letter calls for an increase in affordable housing investments, including expansion of the Housing Choice Voucher Program to all eligible households to be included in the anticipated infrastructure package. Given that 32 mayors signed this letter, the Universal Housing Choice Voucher Program is clearly a priority for my district, as well as many cities throughout our country, regardless of the party leading the city. I do believe that we need these vouchers, and I very much support them. I'd also say this. I'm on foreign affairs, and I've also traveled a lot on my own and with my family. You go to Europe, and you don't see the homeless in the same way that you see them here in the United States. You just don't see the number of homeless. It's not the case. They have the ability to house their people. We should too. Now, I've been following the conversation. I do think that we need more facilities to treat people. I absolutely do. I think it's terrible what California did and released people into the cities without giving them proper treatment. But I think after you get treatment, you need a house. You need some place to stay. That's reality. So I did a little something here that's personal. I thought, housing cost. And so I took our own situation, my wife and I. We bought our home in 1993, and we paid $176,000 for our home. It's not a large home. It's a little less than 2,000 square feet, but it's in San Diego. So I put it into two separate inflation calculators, first into smartasset.com, to see how much that house would be worth today if it just simply followed inflation. So in 1993, again, we spent $176,000. That's what our house cost us. Today, it would be worth $327,000 under Smart Asset. I put it under another inflation calculator, and the same house, $176,000 in 1993, would be worth $325,269. So it's a difference of about $2,000, but basically $325,000 or $327,000. We just got an unsolicited offer for our house. It's over $1 million more than that. That's how do you if you're a young person, if you're a person starting, how do you afford a house now? The truth of the matter is we do have to build more, especially in California, places where people want to live. We do have to build more houses. We do have to loosen the zoning up. I agree with all that. But at the same time, we have to help people that are trying to make it. We need these vouchers. I mean, it should be a right. And I do agree with the comments, Social Security and all these other things that one side complains about and how horrible it is. Now they all defend. I mean, like Dodd-Frank. I mean, that's all I heard. I don't hear it now since the banks came up and said, thank God for Dodd-Frank. But at the beginning, that's all I heard for 6 years here. So what about these vouchers? What's wrong with having a voucher for a person that needs a house? How is that wrong? Could someone just explain to me how people are against giving a person a place to stay, especially with the cost of housing being so damn high? Someone want to take a shot at that? How is that wrong? Mr. Husak, I've respected what you've said, and I've agreed with some of what you've said, but I think you might have a disagreement. Why?
Well, I'll address it. I think they have their place, but I don't think it should be an open-ended entitlement. I really fear that we're going to discourage economic upward mobility. You're going to hit that income limit. People are going to say, I don't want to earn that much more because then I'll lose my voucher. That already happens. So the theory of the program may look like one thing. As it's implemented, it's another. If we want to have an income supplement program and let people decide where they want to spend their money, they may rather double up and save their money because they want to buy a house. They really might. People do it, And so it might be better to increase the earned income tax credit. It might be better to get rid of the marriage penalty in the earned income tax credit. This is an income problem, not only a housing problem.
I do agree with you in flexibility. I do think that some people would want to double up and save their money to buy a house. And I do agree there should be flexibility. But at the same time, I have to insist a person has to be able to live in a home and not on the street. Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Increasing the government's involvement in the private sector can have and always does have negative consequences. We cannot figure that now that there are landlords who are putting their capital and resources on the line in order to build and provide housing for people. They're doing that. And in my district, the Austin Apartment Association filed a lawsuit against the city when they tried to force private landlords to accept individuals who utilize federal housing assistance. Their lawsuit says the city will be forcing property owners to agree to one-sided contract with HUD, which included approximately 400 pages of rules and regulations. The lease with HUD goes far beyond the lease that a vast majority of renters sign in Austin's big government. Now, we should not force, and I repeat, we should not force private landlords to accept public housing vouchers if it is not in their best interest. You don't have to do business with everybody you come in contact with. Navigating the web of federal bureaucracy is not an easy task, and this action would add significant additional costs that would be detrimental to many smaller landlords. And any federal expansion of housing programs should remain voluntary for landlords to participate. So, Mr. Husak, can you talk about some of the business reasons as to why we should not force landlords into a partnership with the federal government and the potential detrimental effects it would have on new housing developments from being built?
Thank you very much for that question. I'm familiar with a property owner in the South Bronx, on the Grand Concourse in the South Bronx. That property owner owns 1,800 units of housing voucher units, 1,800. They have a whole department of their property management business that is solely dedicated to hiring attorneys and others to process all of those vouchers. And they have a direct deposit from HUD set up. Down the street, Mr. Mom and Pop landlord, they can't afford those attorneys. It's going to impose additional costs on them. In addition, if you don't get paid, if you don't get that 30%, then that's a big problem for you. And so you have other reasons beyond whether it's discrimination based on source of income that you may not want to rent.
Well, again, the government gets involved, prices go up. If we want to expand economic opportunity in America, we need to support the job creators in our country. We need to, frankly, cut taxes, and that flows to the workers. A part of this includes creating a safe environment for people to live and for businesses to thrive. So, Mr. Husak, you wrote an article about a candidate who's running to be New York City's next mayor. He's a Democrat who is opposed to the defund the police movement, new concept. While this seems like a common sense for many of us, this radical policy has been embraced by many on the left. So, Mr. Husak, can you talk about the economic prospects of areas that choose to cut their police budgets and move forward with these radical policies?
Well, I'm not a criminal justice expert, and I don't represent being one. However, I will say this, that safety, well, I'll just tell you a story. My middle son moved after high school from Boston to Clarksdale, Mississippi in the Delta. And he lived in a majority minority neighborhood, and he was a musician there. And when he got there, the police took him aside and they said, listen, if you buy a TV, don't put it out on the sidewalk. Don't put your package out on the sidewalk. Somebody might know that you have this TV. And his neighbors told him, we have to be so careful because it's hard for us to save money, to buy things, for our homes to increase in value, because public safety is not assured. Public safety is the basis for home values, for wealth accumulation among all classes of people. We must have public safety. That's the foundation of our prosperity. That's why I wrote about Mr. Adams in New York.
Okay, thank you. The federal eviction moratorium is supposed to come to an end at the end of this month, as we've been talking about. I've been expressing some concern about this policy because we simply are shifting the burden from renters to landlords who will still have to pay their bank notes. I mean, they have to still pay their costs. I have heard rumors that the Biden administration is considering extending the eviction moratorium. So finally, Mr. Husak, could you describe the effects of the eviction moratorium has on the housing ecosystem as a whole, and then let us know if you think that President Biden should extend this policy?
I think we need to pay the back rent, the arrearages of hard-hit people. I think that's appropriate, just as PPP was appropriate and was effective. Stimulus was effective and creative. However, eviction in Massachusetts, when there was a pause in the eviction moratorium and evictions were allowed to be filed, motions for eviction, the majority of those evictions were not for non-payment of rent. They were for lease violations. One of the ways in which tenants are made safe when disruptive tenants face the threat of eviction. That's part of landlording too.
I yield my time back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This hearing has nothing to do with defund the police. This is about housing. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the committee. And some of the questions that I have, they might have responded to it, but I just want to make sure. And this is for the whole panel. And you're probably familiar with the study by Columbia University showing that the University Voucher Program will lift 9 million people out of poverty and reduce child poverty by 36%, and decrease racial disparities in poverty rates among white and Black households. Clearly, the research shows that the University Voucher Program could help improve millions of people's home life. However, as the current housing choice voucher program stand, it requires landlords to go through a lengthy leasing process, especially compared to the standard leasing process. After the rental application is completed, the unit must be inspected and approved. Scheduling these inspections can take a long time, and the landlord loses income while the unit is off the market. Landlords can incur additional costs if improvements are required by the HCV program does not cover these costs. The need to improvement made to inspection, approval, and overall leasing process. Do any of y'all support the voucher program in this regard, and what can be done to cover some of these costs and at the same time give the landlord a little break in what they have to do? That's for the whole panel.
Congressman, I can start off by responding. I think you've raised a really good point. I don't think these are impossible challenges. I think these are actually challenges for which we largely have the answers, but we need to scale up. So as it relates to the inspection process, it is possible to differentiate those components of the physical quality of the structure that really represent true health and safety components versus ones which are more minor in nature, and to focus our oversight on those elements. We also see an increasing use of technology that can be scaled up, where folks are using video technology or photo records, doing spot inspections that make this a little bit less onerous for owners and a little bit more cost effective for voucher administering entities. And lastly, I think that there are good programs that are out there that do provide financial incentives to owners to offset some of these costs. I think that is an important part. The bipartisan Coons and Kramer bill in the Senate is a good example of trying to take that one level further, which I think makes a lot of sense in terms of helping owners to deal with the kinds of challenges that they do face in bringing their housing units up to a reasonable level of quality.
Those are certainly common sense suggestions. I would also point out the importance of expanding the Moving to Work program, which allows housing authorities which administer housing choice vouchers to choose how they want to spend the funds that they do have and not have them all be categorically directed. And that gives them the flexibility to direct resources where they need it most. That program has been stalled at a very low level for many, many years. Its experimental results have been good. The time has come to expand Moving to Work.
I would like to jump in here and just note that there are also, I agree with Ben in what he laid out in terms of improvements that we can make to the program. I think all of us have suggested different kinds of improvements, including to the inspection process and providing some flexibility, maybe through admin dollars or through other sources of funding to do incentives for landlords. I know that in a number of communities, local banks have helped set up risk mitigation funds that provide some security for landlords that if there's damage to a unit, that it will be paid for through that risk mitigation fund. I know that the Emergency Solutions Grants funding that was provided through the CARES Act allows specifically for landlord incentives like double the security deposit and other types of incentives for landlords. And I'd like to take a look at that data and how that played out once that program is completed. So there are a number of good public-private ways to ensure that landlords are also protected in the use of housing choice vouchers, because this is both about the tenants and about the landlords who are providing the units.
Okay, thank you. And I had another question, Madam Chair, but I yield back. My time is running out on me.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Waters. This has been a very interesting hearing. I'm delighted to be able to work on the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee as ranking member, and look forward to working with my friend, Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Husak, it's good to see you again. In Arkansas, the average rent in the Metro Little Rock area for 3 bedrooms is about $1,100. And that compares to $2,700 out in Los Angeles. So we have a very affordable housing market in Little Rock. If we were to have an entitlement program and vouchers, what would happen to that affordability in a place like Little Rock, in your view?
Well, as I said previously, anytime you increase demand, you are at risk of pushing up the prices because you have the classic preconditions for inflation. So I think that's a risk. But I love that you're pointing out that there's affordability now. And we're seeing an exodus from the state of California. It lost population for the first time in its history. People are discovering Little Rock. They're discovering Fayetteville, right? They're discovering Buffalo. They're discovering that there are affordable, my hometown of Cleveland. They're discovering it. You can work from home. We're having a sorting out of the housing affordability problem. This is not the time for a vast intervention in the market while the market itself is adjusting.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And of course, the dream of the voucher program would be a family would have that and be able to move to a better neighborhood or a better school or closer to a better job. And we've been talking a lot about landlords, but what about the portability of a voucher? If I have a voucher from the Public Housing Authority in Little Rock, may I use that public housing voucher and move to a community 30 minutes away if that's better for me?
Yeah, it depends on the housing authority, but that is happening more. But I'd like to return to this idea of the opportunity neighborhood. To me, the idea that you have to move to a better neighborhood, quote unquote, better neighborhood in order to have a better life. When did we give up on the idea that poor neighborhoods can be good neighborhoods?
Yeah.
CDBG was about doing something about that. You know, we're not going to have enough vouchers for all poor people to move to rich neighborhoods. That's just not going to happen. We've got to address ourselves to the core public services of low-income neighborhoods, safety, education, parks. That's what we have to do, rather than saying we're going to pay everybody to move out.
Amen. We need to get you a pulpit. That's excellent preaching. I agree with what you're saying. I was looking at the San Bernardino County website this morning, and they say their goal in San Bernardino County is for all families to prosper and achieve well-being. And I also spoke to the mayor out at San Bernardino, the county seat of that county. I was very intrigued by your testimony. You talked to Mr. Barr about it briefly. Can you go into a little bit more detail about the priorities there in San Bernardino County, California, about how they're successfully moving from entitlement to empowerment for their family?
Yeah, first of all, it's a voluntary program. If you move into San Bernardino Housing Authority, you can agree, it's voluntary, to a 5-year ceiling on your assistance. But if you do agree, you get a flat rent for those 5 years. That's just a big deal. Would you want to live in a place where the more money you earn, the higher your rent goes? And yet we do that to all, 6 million poor households in public housing and housing choice vouchers. San Bernardino says, you want to save money? We'll have an escrow account for you. You want to graduate from this housing choice voucher program and buy a house rather than be consigned to rent? You don't accumulate wealth in rental housing unless you put it to some other use. That's what the failure of public housing was, always that. So the results were very positive. Earned income for families in the program increased by an average of 31.4% over 4 years. Full-time employment increased 20% and unemployment decreased 26%. It's a small place, it's a small program, but it's really worth looking at those results that can be had by changing the terms of receipt.
And again, that speaks to the local market conditions, the local supply demand, the local innovation of our communities to try to solve these problems that are closest to the people. And while one big one-size-fits-all national entitlement program, I think, will just create more dislocation instead of more help. And I thank you for the discussion. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like also to apologize for having missed part of this, so I hope I'm not duplicating other questions that have been asked. Ms. Cunningham, in your testimony, you spoke of providing carrots and sticks for land use and zoning reform, citing the issues that arise with exclusionary zoning requirements. And one idea that I'm interested in exploring is to have some of those carrots and sticks be based on big data analytics, where you say, okay, if this person exercises this voucher in this particular neighborhood, that there would be a benefit given to the landlord, given to the community that accepts it, and as well as given to the person. And is this something where, so instead of having absolute hard definitions of this is an opportunity zone, this is not, you just have a sort of a big data analytic benefit. If you understand what I'm saying, have things like this been looked at?
I think that, thanks for the question, first of all. I think that I agree that there needs to be carrots and sticks. I haven't thought, it's an interesting proposal to think about big data and how to use that in the carrots. And I think one of the ways we are thinking about and recommending land use and zoning is really having the federal government provide some carrots in terms of competitive grant programs, and then sticks, localities get a lot of transportation funding. And so, withholding funding from communities that are not providing and producing affordable housing, I think is really critical. I want to add one more thing around the supply and demand issue. I do agree that land use and zoning is really important, but there's been a lot of talk about housing vouchers expanding and driving up costs. When the fact is that most of the people who qualify for this expansion, if we were to actually expand to universal housing vouchers, are actually in housing right now. And so that wouldn't actually increase the demand for units. It would just make it possible for the tenant to be able to afford their housing. And it would also allow the landlord to be paid instead of the tenant struggling each month. So I just want to really highlight that as an important point.
Thank you, and I agree with that. You know, any run up in the rental prices would presumably be temporary, and the free market would take over and say, "Hey, there's a profitable opportunity to make more rental units that fit the voucher characteristics." And well, does anyone else have any comments on that? Whether just carefully designed positive financial incentives, you know, for the community as well as the the voucher holder and the landlord might provide the proper mix to encourage communities to build more voucher eligible and voucher welcoming housing.
I'll just say this: new housing is very expensive. I think the idea that we should build new housing for the poorest people with subsidies is the most ambitious kind of affordable housing. For instance, with the low-income housing tax credit program in the state of California now, those units are costing close to $400,000 per unit. So we're not going to get that much housing bang for our buck, as they always say in federal budget terminology. It's better for the private market to supply low cost, in answer to a question I dodged before about construction methods, manufactured housing, and I don't mean only mobile homes. That's bringing down costs. We ought to look to that rather than deep subsidies.
Congressman, if I may jump in on that, I think we live today in a world in which the new multifamily housing that's getting built is either deeply subsidized traditional affordable housing or often higher end market rate housing. I think one of the promises of moving towards a huge expansion of the voucher program, universal voucher, could be an ability for market rate multifamily developers to be able to onboard both the vouchers and hopefully in tandem with much shallower subsidy sources that are less onerous, you know, tax-exempt bonds, Federal Housing Administration insured debt programs that would allow for a stimulus, if you will, to get more housing to get built and really leverage the market rate side of things to be doing that. And I think that is something that we've missed a little bit in the dialogue, but I think should be flagged.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And my timer is nearly expired, so I will yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is now recognized for 5 minutes. Is Mr. Davidson on the platform?
Yes, Madam Chairwoman, thank you. I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony here today. And I appreciate the chance to discuss the important issue of homelessness here in the United States. The issue's only been exacerbated by the pandemic this past year. And I'm it's especially heartbreaking for me to see veterans in particular. According to an article in the Military Times from this past March, veterans make up about 8% of the homeless population. And for people who previously served our country to defend the American dream, they especially deserve a solution that will provide them with every opportunity to achieve it. I'll admit that I'm a bit intrigued by the idea of vouchers. I believe vouchers following every student would improve our schools. Perhaps, as some have argued today, vouchers to all those in our federal housing safety net would improve the quality of their housing options. I'm also encouraged that some of my colleagues who want to cancel those with income from sources they personally disfavor, like fossil fuels, want to now embrace civil liberties and enact non-discrimination clauses on sources of funds. I think that would be great to see it embraced universally for a wide range of things. And frankly, this kinds of authoritarian use of payment systems for power have been rightly the focus of our committee in the past. Things like redlining and practices that block people from access to the financial system by using money as a means of control rather than a means of payment system. So these are principles that we're talking about today that I find interesting. And certainly we have a problem with homelessness in the country, as we can see with tent cities in our nation's capital and in so many other places around the country. Mr. Husak, I'd like to follow up on a conversation that you had with Senator Toomey. When you were in the Senate hearing in April. Purchasing a home is the cornerstone of the American dream for many. And in the past, Congress has pushed policies that attempt to help people purchase a home. Ultimately, these policies will sometimes put people on a path towards foreclosure. Can you talk about the dangers when Congress tries to impose a quick fix when it comes to promoting affordable housing?
Well, the question implies questions about affordable housing mandates and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are beyond the scope of this hearing. So I hope I don't stray too far. But I've been concerned and have written and published for many years about the impact on working class, low income homeowners who find themselves in high delinquency areas because of low doc, no doc loans that they weren't all initiated in the housing crisis because of affordable housing mandates, but to some extent they were, and that was modeled by the federal government. My concern is always for the people, as Bill Clinton said, who work hard and play by the rules. And if they're making their payments and the fellow next door is not making his payments because he never should have owned that house in the first place, you are hurting the hardworking working class. And the fact that communities of color were disproportionately harmed in the 2008 financial crisis was a tragedy, and it was caught up in all of that.
Well, I appreciate you recognizing that. And frankly, when people are foreclosed on, often they become homeless, maybe not structurally forever, but for a period of time. And then when you talk some of the other issues, earlier this year, the majority pushed for $80 billion in public housing capital funding to be included in the administration's infrastructure plan. If the current proposal before us today were to become law and everyone were guaranteed a voucher if they fell below certain income levels, landlords were forced into participating, why would we need public housing? Wouldn't the voucher system cover the need?
Well, we have public housing and we need to reform public housing. We need to reform the terms of the voucher program. There are as many people in public housing today as there are in vouchers. However, there's a lot that we can do to extricate people from public housing.
I appreciate that. And the need for reform is why I've proposed the People Care Act. And just like a lot of the programs that are in there that do need reform, the solution generally, just like today, is to launch a new program rather than to look at all of them. So I hope we'll come at it with a holistic approach. We can enact the People Care Act, and people that are interested on both sides of the aisle, I'd love to talk with you. Thanks for your expertise today. My time's expired and I yield.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses. This has been a fascinating hearing. I hope you'll allow me to deviate a little bit from the Section 8 discussions. There's just a wonderful homelessness support services company. I live in DuPage County in Illinois. DuPage PADS really exists upstream of the Section 8 issue. They provide temporary housing, transition services, job training, often in congregate facilities and church basements. And if they fail, Section 8 doesn't matter because we don't get the people off the street and into the system so that they can then look at longer term services. And in talking with them in preparation for this hearing, there is two things that I want to start with Ms. Cunningham and just get your thoughts on these, and then time permitting get some others. The first was that they said that the single hardest families they have to place are large families. that our affordable housing, Section 8 and otherwise, is much easier to place a single individual than in one case, they've got a family of 9 who's just, they can't get them out of a church basement or a hotel in this current COVID moment. Can you speak at all to understanding that we have a problem with affordable housing in this country? What about the types of housing? Is there anything we can do to make sure that we have types of housing that better match to the need? Ms. Cunningham?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. I do think that it can be challenging to help a family who has a lot of children or is also including grandma or grandpa into the private market. There are not enough big bedroom units for those families. I mean, part of that is with the Housing Choice Voucher Program is to ensure that those families are getting extra assistance in navigating the private market and finding those landlords that do actually have those units. But then also, and I noted this in my testimony, we not only need voucher assistance, but we need to develop housing units. So the expansion of a Housing Choice Voucher Program should be within the broader strategy of both investing in vouchers, but also investing in development of units.
Okay, I want to shift, if I can, to COVID sort of orthogonally. When COVID hit, most of their housing is in churches and other congregate facilities that simply didn't work anymore. And we had a lot of really painful conversations about what they were going to do with that. And they moved pretty nimbly and got hotels to volunteer spaces. They didn't have the budget for it, but thankfully through some of our CARES support, they were able to provide budget and get people into hotels. And it was pretty painful. And in debriefing with them now, as we sort of start to emerge from COVID, they said that in hindsight, that was actually hugely beneficial. They've seen increases in the health quality because, as they put it, if you have a door that locks in a shower, a whole bunch of other problems go away. They've seen a huge surge in children in their care, not because the children were housed before, but because parents might rightfully have had some concerns about bringing a child into a group sleeping facility, but are okay in a hotel. And they were pleading with me to say, can you please make sure that the financial supports continue? So if you had a wish list, what of the changes, the temporary changes we made during CARES, would you like to see continued to make sure that we don't backtrack and all of a sudden, take one step forward and 2 steps back as these programs expire?
Congressman, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that I wanted to start with that, but also that Ms. Oliva or Mr. Metcalf might be a great response.
Okay.
But let me start by saying that it's really important that we re-envision our shelter system, our congregate shelter system, because we found out during the pandemic that it didn't work and that we do need to have more individualized units like single room occupancy units for people who have temporary housing needs. So let me turn it over to Mr. Metcalf or Ms. Oliva.
Just to quickly observe, if I can, I mean, one of the great triumphs, I think, of the last year has been our ability to repurpose so many hotels to serve folks coming off the streets. To California, some 94 hotels have been converted, some 6,000 new units have been created. But much of that has been stopgap. There has not been the sort of capital put in place to be able to continue to house those individuals to keep them sort of stably located and assisted. And so we really are at risk of seeing that all fall apart as we run out of the operating money to keep those folks stably housed. And so California, the governor has proposed some $3.5 billion in new state funding to capitalize reserves, but it's a really awkward way to solve the problem. We desperately need that additional voucher assistance to complement these interventions for the long term.
And I would agree both with Ben and Mary, but also add that in the American Rescue Plan, the fund for homelessness assistance the home program does include some funding in order to sustain non-congregate shelter in the long run.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll yield back.
Mr. Kustoff is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for conducting today's hearing. Thank you to the witnesses as well. Mr. Husak, if I could, with you, with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, I think we can all agree that there are some changes, maybe significant changes, that need to be made to the program. One issue that's come to my attention is the funding formula for the program and the administration expenses of the issuing agency or the authority. If I could, the formula fails to account for the logistical differences of agencies running the voucher program on a statewide basis, as opposed to authorities that handle vouchers for a city or county or municipalities, etc. Many of the state agencies lose money due to, and I'm going to characterize it as a one-size-fits-all formula. My opinion, ultimately, that harms the consumers in the form of reduced services and assistance. My question is, your familiarity with the formula, and what would your thoughts be about updating the one-size-fits-all approach to it?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Congressman. Of course, federal funds are allocated on those kind of formulas in all sorts of programs. We have 3,000 public housing authorities in this country. That's a whole heck of a lot of overhead. And so it may be that we can consolidate housing authorities, whether it's on a statewide or a regional basis, that might make it more efficient to distribute those vouchers with lower overhead. I still think the most important thing is to change the terms of the vouchers, but I would welcome a more efficient allocation for sure.
So when you talk about changing the terms, what are some things that you would look at if you could wave a magic wand?
Well, the first thing I would do is to allow people to not pay more rent when they earn more income. I know I've said it before, but it just pains me to think of people who are struggling to get ahead, to get a higher paying job, and knowing that they're paying a higher marginal tax rate than Warren Buffett. We know that, right?
Right.
We know it now anyhow. And so why should they pay 30 cents on a dollar more in rent? And why should they be encouraged not to report their income, to have a second income in the house that they don't report, or they don't want to have, be known? So that, to me, if I could change one thing tomorrow, I would have flat rents for all new tenants in exchange for a ceiling on 5 years for housing vouchers.
Thank you. If I could shift gears for just a moment, you've been critical about how the exclusionary zoning laws have been used in municipalities across the country. Could you elaborate for a moment how the zoning laws limit the supply of affordable housing and ultimately harm lower income Americans?
Yeah, they harm middle income Americans, all sorts of income levels. When you have 2-acre zoning with one house on it, and if it was 1/4-acre zoning, do the math, you'd have 8 houses. That's a lot more houses. And so that just redounds through our system. I don't agree with one of my colleagues who said we need to use the stick of federal transportation funds and threaten to withdraw funds. I'll tell you why. A lot of wealthier communities in this country, they don't receive any CDBG funds. They don't receive any DOT funds. They would be exempt, and they may be the worst offenders. So I think we have to have HUD persuade our municipalities through model zoning that, look, it's in your interest to do this. It's in the interest of your children and your grandchildren so that they can stay where they grew up. It doesn't mean high-rise public housing. That's what they're afraid of. That may be politically incorrect to say, but that's what they're afraid of. We have to say, no, we're talking about 2-family houses on small lots, the way we built before zoning came into this country everywhere. We knew how to build affordable housing all over this country. We forgot how.
Thank you, Mr. Husak. And with that, I'll yield back my remaining time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being just so steadfast on this issue. I was very proud in my very first full committee FSC hearing that what was before us was your bill to end homelessness. So I thank you for your steadfast leadership in this space. While the Housing Choice Voucher Program has a proven track record of reducing homelessness and improving lives, especially for domestic violence survivors, veterans, Black and Brown households, and persons with disabilities, it has yet to reach its full potential. Only 1 in 5 people who qualify for one currently receives one, and the average wait time in some towns in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is 10 years, a decade. Transforming the Housing Choice Voucher Program into an entitlement program similar to Medicare or Medicaid is the bold, transformative, and necessary change that my constituents need right now. Constituents like a single mother in Hyde Park who is currently battling cancer and has been on the Housing Choice Voucher Program wait list for 5 years. An elderly couple in Roslindale surviving on fixed Social Security disability insurance and struggling to keep up with the rising cost of rent. They have been slipping further and further into poverty while on the wait list for 8 years. A now single mother in Boston who left her marriage due to domestic violence has been living in a 2-bedroom unit with her 5 children while waiting on a voucher for more than 4 years. And a frontline hospital worker and single mom in Dorchester who has been just barely getting by while serving on the front lines of the pandemic. She has been on the wait list for 17 years. Providing a universal voucher program would lift 9 million people out of poverty, reduce child poverty by 36% overall, and by over 80% for families of color, and decrease racial disparities in poverty rates among whites and Black households. Ms. Oliva, countless families across my district who qualify for but are still awaiting a voucher are extremely vulnerable to homelessness once the eviction moratorium expires. These families are already stretched thin due to the pandemic, illness, trauma, and low wages, and are left making unconscionable choices so they can pay their rising rent costs. Can you please explain the potential, why it is transformative for a universal housing choice voucher program and its alignment with the fight for racial justice?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that might be one of the most important things for us to examine as we think about housing choice voucher expansion. We know that because we have insufficient funding for this program, it actually prevents assistance from reaching 15 million low-income people of color who live in rental housing and face unaffordable housing costs. And that, as you noted, expanding vouchers to all eligible people would have significant impact on poverty, which would benefit people of color the most, and they would experience the steepest declines in poverty. We also know that people of color, especially Black, Latinx families and individuals, are overrepresented in homelessness. So we can understand really looking at it from a racial justice perspective, how housing justice and racial justice actually overlap. They are the same thing, because without housing justice, it is really hard to achieve racial justice.
Thank you.
While we have, thank you.
Thank you. And before my time runs out, I also wanted to ask you to comment on the criminalization for those that are unhoused that has increased over the last 15 years. What impacts would universal vouchers have for helping marginalized populations avoid homelessness and criminalization?
As I noted in my testimony, in 2020, we saw for the first time since we've been collecting this data that the number of individuals who are living on the streets exceeded the number of individuals who are living in shelters. This is creating tension and criminalization in communities across the country that is re-traumatizing for people who are experiencing homelessness and who are quite vulnerable. The expansion of housing choice vouchers would really allow for a massive decrease in the number of people in unsheltered locations and an increase in the amount of permanent supportive housing like HUD-VASH that would be available for folks who are living in unsheltered locations. Thank you for that question.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry. Also want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Something that I don't think has gotten enough attention during this hearing is just the sheer cost of implementing a program such as universal housing vouchers. As our national debt climbs above $28 trillion, we should not be adding even more mandatory spending programs, especially to the tune of roughly $160 billion per year. Mr. Husick, I do not believe that a new housing voucher entitlement would do anything to address the main cause of high housing cost, which is the inability of localities to produce more units of housing. And I'm thrilled you mentioned manufactured housing during Representative Foster's time, because in the 6th District of Tennessee, which I represent, 12.9% of total occupied housing units are manufactured homes. Manufactured housing is the most affordable home ownership option available nationwide for minorities, underserved, and low-income borrowers. According to the U.S. Census data, 90% of new homes under 75,000 are manufactured housing. Mr. Husick, could you expand on how manufactured housing could be key as communities develop strategies to address their affordable housing shortages?
Thank you, Congressman Rose. The first thing they have to do is to permit it to be used in their localities. Right? That's a zoning issue, a building code issue, but manufactured housing is not just mobile homes anymore. We're talking about a full-on substitute for so-called stick-built housing, which can be done on a mass scale. And there's, this goes back in history. I mentioned Levittown, which was the archetype American post-war suburb. That's how Mr. Levitt made those houses so cheap, is he had set up an assembly line. It's time proven. We need to use those methods again. So yes, it's a big part of it.
Mr. Husick, you discussed earlier in the hearing about the importance of working at the city and town level for better city planning to increase the housing supply, and you've just been referring to that again. What would be your suggestions for us as legislators at the federal level as we go and talk with our local leaders?
Well, I think, again, this is something that you as people who are in political life are best at, and that's persuasion. And persuasion has to be built on the idea that why don't we have 2-family houses in this town anymore? Why don't we have 3-family houses? Why don't we have small apartment buildings? People could move from those. Communities want replacement populations. In order to have new young families move in, they have to have points of entry. If they don't, then older people are going to sit in their homes and age out, and communities are going to be in trouble without replacement population. So I think you can do a lot to persuade that, by the way, if you don't do this, HUD's going to come at you with a big stick too.
Thank you. Ms. Oliva, I know that during your time at HUD, you worked to find ways to help cities stretch their dollars. So this question is for you. I read an article earlier this week about a report from LA's chief administrative officer about a homeless campground the city is setting up in a parking lot. It appears that the city is allowing homeless individuals to move their tents into this parking lot in a centralized location so that they can provide them with running water, hygiene stations, and other services. What is alarming is that it is costing Los Angeles $2,663 per participant per month to provide a tent in an empty parking lot. You could provide every participant 2 one-bedroom apartments for that price. According to the report, LA is using CARES Act funding to do this. How is it possible that providing someone a tent in a parking lot costs $2,663 per participant per month?
Thank you for that question. While I'm not familiar with those particular numbers that you're citing, shelter is expensive. That is actually why we're having this conversation today, because if we had universal housing vouchers available for those folks who are in unsheltered locations, we could actually be accessing housing resources for people who are experiencing homelessness, who are elderly, who are young people, who are mentally ill, and the services they need to maintain those houses. So I actually think that it's important to look at the housing side of that discussion.
Thank you. And Chairwoman Waters, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I represent New York 15, the South Bronx, which during COVID-19 has been shown to be what I call the essential congressional district of New York City. It's home to hundreds of thousands of essential workers who put their lives at risk during the peak of the pandemic so that the rest of the city could safely shelter in place. It is nothing short of a moral outrage that our essential workers, upon whom all of us depend, cannot increasingly afford to live in a city or a country that could not survive and succeed without them. As far as I'm concerned, housing is as much a human right as education, and housing ought to be as much of an entitlement as education. The best path to housing as a human right, to housing as an entitlement, is housing vouchers for all program, which is
so I'm hoping that no one had asked number 5. Okay. All right.
Which has been proposed by Chair Waters. According to the Harvard Joint Center on Housing Studies in 2019 pre-COVID, there were 37 million Americans who spend more than 1/3 of their income on rent, and nearly half of those Americans spent more than 1/2 of their income on rent. Housing vouchers for all would bring affordability to tens of millions of Americans. The American Jobs Plan proposes a historic investment of over $300 billion in housing. But more important than the dollar amount is how those dollars are spent. If we expand housing supply without expanding housing subsidy, we run the risk of creating housing without actual affordability for the poorest Americans. We run the risk of creating the illusion rather than the reality of affordable housing. Less than 1% of the housing funds in the American Jobs Plan has been set aside for rental assistance. My first question is for the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. What is the danger of prioritizing housing supply to the exclusion of housing subsidy?
Thank you so much for that question, Congressman. I think you're exactly right. We know that housing vouchers are only available for 1 in every 4 eligible households. And we know that we need a balanced approach. We need both supply. We've talked about that quite a bit in this hearing today. We need both supply side investments in areas that have a supply shortage, and we need affordability investments in many areas across the country. So as I noted in my testimony, in most cases, unless a household also receives a voucher or other type of rental assistance, construction subsidies that we're talking about on the supply side generally don't produce housing with rents that are affordable for those households with incomes at or below the poverty line. And that is who we're talking about when we're talking about people who are experiencing homelessness. We are talking about people with incomes at or below the poverty line. So in order to make that reduction in homelessness and to really create both a prevention aspect of this program as well as an exiting homelessness aspect of this program, we need both. We need those supply side investments for both areas that, we need the affordability investments for areas both that have the supply shortage and where affordability is the main problem.
And I noticed much has been said about cost, but I guess my question for you and for others is, what's the cost of homelessness and housing insecurity? If you lack basic housing stability in your life, it has a destabilizing effect on every aspect of your life. It makes you more vulnerable to substance abuse, mental illness, deaths of despair, contact with the criminal justice system, a whole host of social challenges that cost society a fortune. Do you agree that the cost of doing nothing or doing too little far exceeds the cost of housing vouchers for all?
Yeah, I think the way that you framed that is exactly right. There's a cost to our public systems, jails, hospitals, child welfare systems, all the public systems, that ambulances, police, that interact with people who are experiencing homelessness in ways that they wouldn't have to interact with them if folks actually had safe, stable, and affordable housing. But more importantly, there is a human cost to the decisions that we're making here. And that human cost is about the people who are experiencing homelessness and the damage and trauma that is created by experiencing homelessness, especially unsheltered homelessness, especially kids and young adults.
And if I can add, and especially women with children and members of the LGBTQ community find themselves very vulnerable. I have had clients who had no mental health issues, lost their Section 8 voucher, were evicted. Nobody would take their Section 8 voucher. They then were made homeless, slept in their car, car was impounded. They lost everything. I've had clients who were raped on the streets because then they lost everything. And then they developed mental health issues that they never had before because of homelessness. And that's something I want to say earlier in terms of one of the number one causes for homelessness is loss of housing. And that's what creates a lot of mental health and physical issues.
And it's worth noting that forms of affordable housing like supportive housing are more cost effective than psychiatric hospitalization and incarceration.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman. And my question, my comments and questions are something that Mr. Husak touched on earlier, but to Ms. Olivia and Ms. Cunningham, throughout the pandemic, millions of unassisted renters have struggled to pay their rent, meaning some landlords have lost needed income in supporting their rental property, especially the mom and pops that haven't been able to make their mortgages.
Is Mr. Gonzalez still on the platform? I do not hear Mr. Gonzalez. He started out and he has stopped. I don't know what has happened. If Mr. Gonzalez is not prepared to continue, I will move on to the next person and we'll come back to Mr. Gonzalez. And so next on the platform, we will have Mr. Lynch from Massachusetts. Is he available? If Mr. Lynch is not available, Ms. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the ranking member for hosting this hearing today. And to our witnesses, thank you very much as well. This is an incredibly urgent conversation. I want to first ask a follow-up in terms of the source of income. You know, unfortunately, there are too many documented cases of housing providers not accepting payment because they choose to discriminate against the source, such as the housing choice vouchers. At the local level, I am particularly proud of the work that both my city of Charlotte and the advocates throughout the 12th district have done to address this source of discrimination income, but we still have a long way to go to make access to housing equitable. You've already heard how long the wait is, but in my district, it's like 11 years to receive a voucher based off of the current rate of admission to the Housing Choice Program. 21% of families who receive a voucher were unable to find housing by the time that the voucher expired after 100 days. So Ms. Cunningham, can you describe why it's so important that we move swiftly to end source of income discrimination nationwide?
Thanks for the question. I do think it's important. When we studied this issue in 2018, we did find that discrimination is a significant problem. And as I mentioned earlier, only 1 out of 3 voucher holders right now are protected by those local source of income protections. And so having a national source of income protection is really critical, not only to protect the voucher holders that this expansion would cover if passed, but also existing voucher holders who are on the program right now.
Thank you. According to the Urban Institute, we know that the population of unsheltered individuals experiencing homelessness has risen dramatically over the past several years. And in my community and those across the country, we've seen tent cities rise to accommodate these individuals. In Charlotte, using CARE funds, our local government was able to help over 200 unsheltered individuals living in a tent city find temporary housing in a hotel where they've received access to other services. Ms. Olivia, how would expanding access to vouchers help our unsheltered populations who are experiencing homelessness?
Thank you for that question. And I want to start by pointing to the HUD-VASH program. For those of you who are familiar, the HUD-VASH program is a program that uses a housing choice voucher as the housing subsidy, and it pairs it with services that are provided by the VA. I know earlier in the hearing we got a question, or we talked a little bit about the impact of homelessness on veterans. HUD-VASH is a proof point on how vouchers can be used to end homelessness among people who are living in unsheltered locations. With the HUD-VASH program, it was really the keystone in our approach. Certainly when I was at HUD, I'm one of the architects of that program. It is one of the keystones to really being able to cut homelessness among veterans, especially unsheltered veterans and chronically homeless veterans who are quite ill. But that was really the centerpiece of our approach to being able to cut veteran homelessness by half in the time over the last several years. So I think that we can take the lessons from HUD-VASH and apply them in other types of situations to ensure that people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness have the housing and service resources that they need in order to maintain stability and pursue their own personal goals.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I just want to say how grateful I am to you for all of your work and diligence around housing. And I just want to reinstate my strong belief that everybody in this country deserves decent, affordable housing. And these are questions of fairness and compassion. So I look forward to advancing these priorities with my colleagues and under your leadership. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
And thank you so very much. I understand Mr. Gonzalez is back on the platform. If so, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Gonzalez? I'm going to move on. Ms. Talib, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you so much to our panel. I know it's been a long hearing, but it's an important one. I really appreciate it. You know, I for years working in the nonprofit sector, I always said low income or poor communities, but I'm just going to start calling my neighbors struggling with housing. These are our low wage neighbors. These are low wage earners. If people start relating how we're taking care of our low wage earners and not just label them as low income, it's income coming from sources that refuse to increase pay, refuses to recognize the importance of increasing minimum wage and how that is really connected very much to access to housing. The state of Michigan, I look at, especially being here in Detroit, it's over 80% Black city. It is, you know, a very strong, of course, words like resilient, but one of the things that is increasingly frustrating for a lot of my neighbors in my district is this idea of unfairness. And they continue to hear, obviously, the excuses after excuses of not having equal access, obviously, to vouchers and how broken that system is. But the one thing, and I hope you might be prepared to talk about this, because this is where my frustration comes from, is, you know, this idea around the low income housing tax credit. So of course, I'm very supportive of that. I'm supportive of having what we call in Detroit, like HUD housing and so forth. But what's happened is it's almost like legalized speculation, y'all. It's like we are legalizing speculation of these developers coming in, and Chairman, you know this. They come in, they make this HUD housing, taking vouchers in, and after 20 years, they have the option of continuing on or not. But they wait until a city like mine, all of a sudden it's called comeback. I don't know where we're coming back from, but and then you see huge developers like Dan Gilbert, other developers coming in, mass evicting everyone out of the building. Many of them are seniors, been in the home for over a decade. Some, I know a woman, 21 years, retired teacher, completely, asked to leave because then all of a sudden they turned them into bougie condos, unaffordable units. And so I don't know if it's you, Ms. Cunningham, that can talk a little bit about this, or the senior fellow, Ann Olivia, you've been talking a little bit about, but I really am wondering, how we as a federal government can stop that push, because I personally feel like when we see the loss of affordable housing in a city like mine, it's because we legalize this kind of speculation and then allow them then to push out our low-wage neighbors into other areas with just no option. And I'm really tired of it. I'm tired of us, blaming our neighbors and talking about those subsidies, but we don't talk about the subsidies that kept many of these developers with a lot of profit, again, all on the backs of American tax dollars. So I don't know if Elma and Ms. Olivia, if you can speak about that, or anybody else.
Thanks for the question. I can start. I do think that building long-term affordability into those contracts for developers is really important. So we want to make sure that we have not only the development of those units, but also long-term affordability. And we want to make sure that there is a preservation strategy for making sure that those units can stay affordable. But I will say that one of the pluses or benefits of the voucher program is that the subsidy stays with the tenant. So, tenants can take that voucher and move across the private market and rent where they can find a unit that's affordable. And so that's a really important benefit of the voucher.
Why we need to support more of that mobility versus what we had in the past. And I say that because I see a lot of these lobbyists coming to us saying, support this tax credit, and it's been misused. This is what we need to support. We need to give it directly to the people. Let them have that self-dependent, that independency that will hopefully get them out of the cycle of poverty. I mean, Chairwoman knows it's 40% of the housing choice voucher recipients are households with babies, with children. And so it's really critically important that we support that. We only have 5 minutes and I ran on and on, but I'm really tired of funding the broken system, and why aren't we doing something bold like a universal voucher system? I don't know, but that's why we're having this hearing. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you very much. And of course, once again, thank you for your focus on homelessness. Homelessness in America says a lot about us, and sadly, what it says is not good. So I really prize and honor all of the folks who are here today and all of the work that you are doing to end homelessness, to stop the scourge of it in our cities. We know that it costs a lot of money. People are worried about the vouchers costing money. Homelessness already costs a fortune in our society. It touches every district, including my own. I'm from suburban Philadelphia. And while Philadelphia has a very serious homeless population, so does my own district of Montgomery and Berks counties. We've participated in the point in time count, which I echo some of the sentiments. It doesn't seem to capture actually the homelessness picture, but our numbers show that every night, at least as many as 1,000 people are homeless in this suburban district. So Ms. Cunningham and Mr. Metcalf, each of you in your testimony described that an expansion of housing choice vouchers should be targeted first to the most vulnerable populations. And I'm curious, what does vulnerable mean in your world? Does the current definition or focus on vulnerable populations include the elderly, those with mental health disorders, and those suffering from substance use or addiction, substance use disorder or addiction? Could you answer that for me? And how can we make sure we have a focus on those populations? Ms. Cunningham first, perhaps.
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. As I noted in my testimony, we should target an expansion of vouchers to the most vulnerable, and that includes people who are currently homeless, people who have disability, and that may include a behavioral health problem or mental health problem, people who have physical disabilities, elderly, and also survivors of domestic violence, people who have really, really, really low incomes, below 15% of AMI, and those who are severely cost burdened. That's how I would define some of it.
Thank you. Mr. Metcalf, your thoughts, and are we focused properly on these categories of people?
Thank you for asking the question. I think it's really important in any scenario where we don't just flip a switch and have universal voucher, but we need to move incrementally. Number one, I would say we need to prioritize those special needs populations that align with other interventions we already have. The VASH voucher is a perfect example of that. We have support from the VA. They just need more housing vouchers to accompany those folks who are coming out of homelessness. Our disability vouchers, another great example of that. So that's the first bucket where we line up with other wraparound services. Second bucket, I think, is the broader category of folks with vulnerabilities who are right on the edge of homelessness. I think there are opportunities to target these so that we can keep those folks from falling into the very expensive situation of living on the streets. And then third, as Ms. Cunningham just said, I think is anybody who is extremely low income or very low income or extremely cost burdened. I think that would be the sort of three-tiered prioritization that I would recommend.
If I could ask Ms. Olivia, I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing it wrong. Olivia, I know I said that wrong. In your testimony, you mentioned the difficulties of measuring vulnerability as well and differs per population. As you point out, it's quite fluid based on life circumstances. Are these groups of vulnerable people described above often left out of the determinations of vulnerability? I have to say, I want to add an emphasis, especially on those struggling with addiction. Here in Philadelphia, suburban Philadelphia, you can see the direct connection between or interconnectedness of mental health and addiction to homelessness.
Thank you for asking me that question. I would agree with both Mary and Ben about sort of how we think about, even if we were to get to universal vouchers, I don't think anybody is suggesting that a switch would be flipped and that everybody would have one on day one, because we would actually have to implement over time and think about how to do that implementation. So yeah, I would agree that we're talking about folks who are experiencing homelessness for a variety of reasons, including folks who want to be in recovery or have substance use disorders. That is definitely a vulnerable population. But it's always hard, as I mentioned in my testimony, frontline workers in the homeless system. I'm also from suburban Philadelphia. I know your area very well. Frontline workers in those areas have to I've watched them make devastating choices about who would get a housing voucher or who would get a permanent supportive housing placement. And we can do better than that. We can do better than that with an expansion of the housing voucher program. Thank you.
I thank you, Ms. Oliva, and I look forward to working with you here in suburban Philadelphia. Thank you, Madam Chair. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Maloney, who is also the chair of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, is now recognized for 5 minutes. Ms. Maloney, you're on. Ms. Maloney, if you're not on at this moment, I'm going to move on to Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia, are you on the platform? If not, the gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Williams, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am on the platform. One of my priorities in Congress is closing the racial wealth gap in my district and across the country. To achieve that goal, we must close disparities in meeting people's fundamental needs. Right now, 39% of all individuals experiencing homelessness in our country are Black, even though Black individuals only make up 12% of the total U.S. population. Ms. Cunningham, Do you believe reducing racial disparities in homelessness could ultimately be a tool to help us address the racial wealth gap and give people of all backgrounds a fair shot at success?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. It's really important. I think that housing vouchers are one of the most powerful tools that we have in our toolbox to address some of the racial disparities that we see in homelessness and also among renters. So if we expanded, and some of the analysis that we've done at the Urban Institute shows that if we've expanded the Housing Choice Voucher Program to everyone who qualifies, then we would actually eliminate or narrow almost all of those gaps. And of course, if the long-term trajectory is to increase wealth among people, you need to have stability in housing first. And so I think it's really, really critical first step to increasing and to decreasing the racial wealth gap is making sure that people have the stability of housing.
Thank you. To reduce racial disparities and get more individuals housed, it's important to have a full picture of the problem. Ms. Oliva, your testimony specifically referenced how unsheltered homelessness has increased every year since 2015. Overall, homelessness has increased in recent years, even though it was on the decline between 2007 and 2015. What are some top factors that could have contributed to these concerning trends over the last few years specifically?
Thank you for that question. I noted in my written testimony that, I get to work in communities all over the country as they're addressing homelessness and get to see the different situations that they're dealing with locally. And what I would note is that there are a lot of homeless services systems across this country that are actually housing more people now than they ever have before, including Los Angeles. And what they can't keep up with is inflow. And that feels different now than it did certainly during my tenure at HUD that ended a few years ago, where we can't keep up with the number of people that are falling into homelessness for the first time even. And there's a number of factors that I'm sure my fellow panelists could speak to better than I could, but that is something that's happening across the country.
Thank you so much. We're noticing that here in Atlanta. I just had a meeting last week with the Atlanta Housing Authority, and we were discussing these same concerns. So thank you for that. And as we work to continue to end homelessness in this country, we need to make sure that we address both housing affordability and access. Mr. Metcalf, in your testimony, you mentioned how important it is to expand both vouchers and the affordable housing supply. What are some principles that we should keep in mind to ensure federal investments are coordinated to tackle both housing access and affordability simultaneously?
Thank you for that great question. So just a couple immediate responses. Number one, I think we need to be very sensitive to the areas of the country where we do have supply constrained markets, where really one of the drivers on affordability is extremely high rents, extremely high home prices that are due to not having enough supply. Those are the areas where we need to focus an ever greater share of our new production. There are many other markets in this country where the challenges are different. They look more like the quality of the underlying housing stock or the need to repurpose older housing stock. And so an adaptive reuse approach may make more sense than new construction in the whole. The second point is we do have a very fractured housing subsidy delivery system. And so the folks who may be on the ground administering the vouchers may look different than those who are deploying the new production subsidy system. So I think one of the things we've seen some promise around is efforts to try and work more at the collaborative scale, to deploy resources at the county level instead of the city level, to create regional authorities that can do some of this work, and to centralize some of these functions at the state level as well. Those are things that help us do better planning and then also do much better execution around solving these challenges.
Thank you so much for your commitment to helping us solve this problem nationally. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks to all the witnesses that have come to share their expertise. Having one more. Okay. the topic is close to home for me. I represent a working class immigrant district that was hit especially hard by COVID-19 and the economic crisis, of course, that came with it. Most of my constituents are renters, and for us, the housing crisis began a long time before the pandemic. My community never recovered from the Great Recession. Tens of thousands of Latinos have left the Logan Square neighborhood in Chicago in the last decade alone. We must break the brutal cycle of disinvestment, displacement, and homelessness. We need to build back better, and that means policies that recognize that housing is a human right. I'd like to ask Professor Metcalf a question. There's a lot that we don't know about what housing and homelessness will look like post-COVID-19. Millions lost their jobs, but home prices are skyrocketing across the country. What impact do you think the virus will have on housing insecurity and homelessness?
That's an excellent question, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from the experience of the last year. I think one of the key top line lessons learned is that we need to bake more resiliency into our housing system. I think we saw the limits. We saw how vulnerable our current housing system is for those low-wage workers who are most at risk during the COVID pandemic. One of the populations that did much better comparatively over this past year were voucher holders and other folks who are stably housed within federally assisted affordable housing. When their incomes collapsed because they were forced to work from home, the federal government was able to quickly step in and pick up a larger share of the total rent. I think the good news is that as we've seen countless states and local governments deploying one-time assistance to help deal with the rearages and help address the emergency rental assistance, we have learned a lot from we all will learn a lot from these deployments of local funds that I think we can then bring back to look for opportunities to improve our mainstream long-term housing systems. And I think, as one of my fellow panelists noted earlier in the hearing, it's actually giving up all kinds of landlords, mom and pops, mid-sized, large-sized landlords experience working with subsidy programs that I think will help them understand that maybe working with in a public-private partnership is much more doable and much less scary than it might otherwise have been. I think it's in some ways, a great opening into an expansion of the voucher program.
Thank you for that. Ms. Cunningham, in the richest country on earth, every human being should have a roof over their head. Our current housing policies simply don't meet the need. Why is it important to make housing an entitlement by expanding our voucher program? And what role could expanding and investing in public housing play in securing housing for all?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. I think as you point out, we are the richest country in the world, and we have a shameful homelessness problem that is highly visible everywhere you walk. I know in my home in Washington, D.C. And so I think that we need to think about housing as a basic need and understand that the housing market really fails to respond to the demand for housing. The private market, we have a private housing market that doesn't produce enough affordable housing for the people who need it. And that is because it doesn't pencil out for developers to really produce that housing. So in order for us to have make sure that everyone is housed in the United States, we need government intervention. And that intervention really is in the form of, first, I think, a universal housing voucher program, which would provide rental assistance for everyone who needs it, but also then, or simultaneously, a strategy for really developing affordable housing and making sure that we can stretch those subsidy dollars. If we actually had the development of more affordable housing, those subsidy dollars would go further because rents would come down a little. So I think it's both important for us to expand housing vouchers so that we can make sure that we're meeting everyone's basic needs and really address that market failure that we have right now.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Mr. Auchincloss for 5 minutes. You're on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I represent a socioeconomically diverse district in Massachusetts, but whether I'm speaking to higher income towns or lower income towns, the burden of housing costs will come up. Double-digit increases in rent and mortgage payments are really putting people on the ropes. And it's especially acute for extremely low-income households. In 2016, the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston found that more than 80% of these extremely low-income households, in Massachusetts were rent burdened. That's partly, of course, a challenge with the voucher program, and we do need to better capitalize and expand the voucher program. It's also a problem of housing supply. For those households in 2016, there were only 46 affordable units available, and only 14 of them were supplied by the market itself. Mr. Metcalf, this first question is for you. I know that at the Turner Center, you've been doing work in conjunction with private companies on innovative approaches to home building, on factory housing that will make the cost per key more affordable. Because if we can't make housing more affordable to build, I know that we cannot make it more affordable to live in. Can you describe some of the barriers to public-private partnerships to scale factory built housing in the urban and suburban growth areas that you described a couple of questions earlier?
Yes, I can talk briefly to that. So it's a great question. I think one of the opportunities for affordable housing is lowering the cost of housing, whether it's subsidized or not. Either it stretches our subsidy dollars farther, or it helps the private sector to do what it should be doing all along. As it relates to factory-built housing, we have seen challenges just in terms of the permitting structure for that. So it can be hard for local governments to get comfortable with what it means to have a factory housing delivered on site. For multifamily housing, we're seeing an increasing share of housing that is using modular technology, either as units or flat packed that are shipped from off-site location. These offer the advantage of being able to be built often somewhat cheaper as well as quicker than traditional stick-built housing, but they're not a panacea. There are many reasons why factory-built housing still is not scaled or scalable. One of those is that we've had a lot of challenges within the modular industry in terms of actually getting factories up and stable and running to deliver with the needs that we have. We've seen factory after factory open up and then go out of business. We do need to continue to innovate in this space and support, I think, those factories that are trying to solve this problem. It is a promising technology.
A follow-up question there, Mr. Metcalf. Do you have a sense for what Congress could do to better catalyze that local private sector partnership that you think could provide the scale that factory-built housing needs to really get the cost per key down while ensuring environmental and quality and standards of living quality? Have you seen good examples of that? Is there a demonstration program that could be put together by HUD? Like, do you have a sense for a productive role?
I may have lost the connection there. I think I missed the end of your question, Congressman.
Will the gentleman continue with his question before I call on Mr. Still? The question had not been answered. There's still time left on the clock. Who did you address the question to, Mr. Auchincloss?
To Mr. Metcalf, Madam Chairwoman. I don't think he heard it fully, maybe on a connection issue on my end. But Mr. Metcalf, what I was asking is whether you've seen examples or can help me think about examples of how Congress could help catalyze local government partnership with factory scale housing to get a cost per key down in a way that ensures high quality homes.
Yeah, that's great. First of all, I would say that HUD today has a very large and important oversight role in terms of regulating manufactured housing, and I think there's opportunities to continue to increase the role, the presence, the technical assistance that HUD provides to local governments. To give you a quick example, here in San Francisco, we recently saw a project move forward that provides permanent supportive for housing for formerly homeless. It uses modular technology. It uses expedited streamlining that the local government has made available to move fast through the entitlement period, and it relies on very flexible upfront capital with very strong time and cost outcomes. We believe that that kind of a project can reduce affordable housing costs for permanent supportive housing by as much as 20% and increase the timing in which it can be built by perhaps 25% as well. So there are great models on how this can be done in partnership with
I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Appreciate you holding today's hearing. I think all of us have been a little tired here looking at Zoom. I think we're all looking forward to being back in person in the not too distant future. You can see some of the technical hiccups, and now we're on less than 7 days notice of today's hearing. And so I, like others, hopefully we're getting back to normal soon. But today we'll navigate through. You're in my Chevy Traverse with me on the road. But Mr. Husak, if I can, several of the bills that my colleagues have attached to today's hearings are offering generous subsidies for households seeking a place to live. And while I do think we all agree that we want to ensure Americans' families can live in decent homes and safe communities, I'm concerned that maybe some of these good intentions aren't really going to knock it out of the park here. And maybe we should be looking at policy solutions that address some of the underlying problems. In particular, I'm examining some of the rising demand that's increased home prices, as well as other policies from Washington, D.C. that are driving up home prices up by 13.2%, according to a recent Case-Shiller index report since the onset of the pandemic. And as one UCLA researcher, Nolan Gray, recently argued in the City Journal, he said all this demand wouldn't be such a problem if housing supply could grow to accommodate it. Boosting demand subsidies in the context of static supply will only mean higher home prices as more dollars chase the same number of homes, meaning that we might have a supply problem that we should be examining here in today's committee hearing, not just a demand assistance issue. And as it stands to reason, I think we should look at ways to encourage the construction of more housing. And so, Mr. Husak, if you would you agree that demand side subsidies might not be the right fit for what's primarily a supply side problem? And are you concerned that these proposals could actually increase the price of housing, making it more difficult for families to find safe and affordable housing?
Right, and I'll reiterate the points that some of your colleagues have made in this regard. That is, more demand chasing a relatively fixed supply is a recipe for inflation. I would point out, in terms of the drawbacks of the current program, I know Congressman Presley talked about long waiting times. I'm looking at the HUD data. The average month on the waiting list for a Section 8 voucher is not 10 years, it's 28 months. And if we had a ceiling on the time that could be used, we can bring that down more. So it makes sense to bring that down rather than to flood the market with new subsidies.
But if I could to dive in, because I think some of this is I want to focus in on the supply concern here. What are the policies that are preventing us from preventing developers from building more housing units, right? As supply increases, natural forces would allow us to have more affordable housing. And I'm concerned that this policy in a static model without building new homes and just focusing on additional subsidies could actually increase price. Could you touch on it? I know some people have discussed earlier on this long online forum that we got here, but just to touch on some of the federal policies that you think that we could be looking at to really drive up the supply of housing to improve affordability. Right. Well, a lot of that is at the state level, and the federal government can influence state action, of course. But if you require solar panels, if you require green technology, all those things may be attractive, but they do come with cost. And there's myriad examples like that in terms of the kind of pipes that are required, but especially the environmental add-ons. Again, there are trade-offs. We can't pretend there are not trade-offs. Additionally, if we flood the market with new subsidies, will young, unemployed, or new college graduates qualify those because their incomes are at the moment low? Will they be discouraged from increasing their incomes because they might be disqualified for the voucher? Suddenly, we may have a world of people who don't fit the profile of the low-income household, low-wage household that we're looking at in this hearing, but who might flood the market and qualify for these subsidies. I share a lot of your concerns about the unintended consequences of such a program of flooding the market, that it might actually, as you note, incorrectly drive up the price of housing, making housing less affordable for individuals, as well as to encourage people who may otherwise be able, through general market forces, to be able to find the income needed for that affordable housing. If I can, while I got a little bit of time left, if I can switch gears slightly and look at the emergency rental assistance program that's been focused in the past. We've got $46 billion that was supposed to address an urgent need.
47.
Excuse me, Madam
Go
Chair.
right ahead. Go right ahead.
We're rolling out of time. Tell you what, I will hold that. I'll put it in writing for you. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I now recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, for 2 minutes to give a closing statement.
Well, thank you, Chair, and let me thank our knowledgeable witnesses for their contributions to the record today and for their ideas. I think we heard 5 key things today. First, we want to help move families from an entitlement world to an empowerment world. We want to find ways to have more affordable housing options. We want to find ways to best help our homeless brothers and sisters. We heard disappointment expressed today in the Biden administration's failure to help tenants with the bipartisan rental assistance that was passed by Congress 6 months ago in December. And we heard from Little Rock to LA to New York, many housing insecure citizens need wraparound services to help them, sometimes principally and primarily along with shelter. And I thank the opportunity to work with my friends at Jericho Way and Our House in Little Rock, and the Doe Fund in New York, Salvation Army in Cleveland. But while we heard those things and we agree about many of them, there is just a disagreement on how to get there. And one of our witnesses remarked that all we need to accomplish is a new $180 billion per year universal voucher entitlement and mandatory participation requirement for all landlords, and more funding to build more housing units in places where housing already costs too much. On the other hand, perhaps there's a more achievable way to accomplish that goal by pursuing approaches that help lower income Americans earn more through better education, better access to better paying jobs, and keep more of what they earn through reforms like the idea of flat rents, or matching and encouraging mobility towards geographies that are more affordable. So I thank my friend, the chairwoman, for this hearing. It was a very interesting one, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. I now recognize myself for 2 minutes to give a closing statement. Today's hearing has highlighted the need to move forward urgently on legislation to make housing choice vouchers universally available. First, if we had this in place prior to the pandemic, so that a housing safety net kicked in automatically, like it does with food stamps, we wouldn't have had to scramble to put together the emergency relief packages we did. We don't reinvent FEMA and disaster assistance every time there is a natural disaster. My Republican colleagues know that being fully employed doesn't guarantee being able to afford housing. It takes nearly 3 times the federal minimum wage to be able to afford a modest apartment nationally. Many people who are experiencing homelessness are in fact working. Finally, my Republican colleagues are simply wrong about the effectiveness of Housing First. The dramatic reductions in veterans and chronic homelessness under the Obama administration from 2010 to 2015 resulted from Housing First, coupled with resources to implement efforts that congressional Republicans and the Trump administration tried to reduce or eliminate funding for every year. But to be clear, Housing First doesn't mean housing only. As Ms. Oliva said, if the only thing a dedicated street out worker can afford a person experiencing homelessness is a bottle of water rather than a place to live, we aren't going to undo the damage done by the Trump administration. They need to be armed with a housing choice voucher and the supportive services to move them from the street to stability. And we might have agreement across the aisle that Medicaid has an important role to play, but I'm committed to, and the Supreme Court requires, ensuring that people confronting mental illness, substance addiction, or other health challenges can live in the community and not in institutions. And I hope we can work together on needed zoning reform to increase supply. I want to especially thank Mr. Green for recognizing and articulating that even with the mental illness assistance to people who are disabled, that we need to have housing. Once they're stabilized, they need a place to go. With that, I ask that a letter signed by almost 1,000 organizations supporting universal vouchers be submitted for the record. And without objection, such will be the order. And I'd like to thank all of our distinguished witnesses for their testimony today. We learned an awful lot. And I ask unanimous consent not only to include in the record this letter that has been signed. I want to say to the members who have participated today that I appreciate your participation. I think that all of the expertise that we have heard today will help us to move forward. And I also want to say to the Republicans today that we heard from Mr. Husak some interesting points that I'm going to explore a little bit further. I'm going to look at flat rate. I don't know the details of that, but I'm going to find out more about it. So with that, I would like to make sure that you understand that we have a few things that we must deal with here before we close. And with that, the meeting is basically keeping that we must do. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.